Good morning and welcome to the beginning of the Scottish Hospital Inquiry's third session of hearings in relation to the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital and Royal Hospital for Children in Glasgow. In saying good morning and welcome, I'm speaking to the legal representatives and others who are in the hearing room in Edinburgh, the legal representatives of the core participants. But I'm also speaking to those who are following us on the YouTube link. The hearings which are beginning today are scheduled to continue until the 15th of November with a break for a week in the week beginning the 14th of October. Now, in the first session of the hearings in relation to the Glasgow hospitals, the inquiry heard from patients and family members of patients about the physical, emotional, and other impacts arising from concern over the state of the built environment of the hospital and the relationship which it may have had to the incidence of infections experienced, particularly by the most vulnerable patients. In the second session of hearings, we heard from the clinicians who are directly concerned in the treatment and care of patients, and also from members of the administrative staff of Greater Glasgow and Clyde Health Board. In this hearing, we'll hear evidence from 5 groups of witnesses. First, the members of the estates staff of NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde, who were involved in the construction and commissioning and subsequent maintenance of the building systems in the Queen Elizabeth, and from those who carried out inspections of these systems. The second group will be clinicians, including clinicians involved in infection prevention and control. The third group will be those who had responsibility for communication with patients. Fourth group will be members of the panel that produced the case notes review in 2021. And finally, we will hear from the independent experts instructed by the inquiry. The evidence, as I anticipated, will be concentrated on the water and ventilation systems of the hospitals. It will examine whether there was evidence of contamination of the water system. It will examine whether there was any instances of non-compliance with relevant regulations and national guidance, and whether that gave rise to risks impacting on patient safety and care. And the inquiry will also hear evidence on the actions taken to investigate and resolve these issues after the handover of the hospitals in 2015, and the extent of the effectiveness of these actions. Therefore, the purpose of this session of hearings is to take forward the themes and questions arising from the evidence of patients and clinicians, which the inquiry has previously heard, in order to understand how that evidence may have been linked to the state and condition of the building systems. The hearing will also seek to understand whether the right of patients and their families be informed and involved in matters relating to their treatment were respected. I'm shortly going to invite counsel to the inquiry to lead his first witness, but first can I just introduce those who are sitting around the table. The centre on my right is Mr. Fred McIntosh, KC, Senior Counsel to the inquiry. Now he is assisted by Mr. Neil Morrison, who's sitting on his left. Mr. Morrison is an advocate, and by Ms. Khanna, who is sitting on his right. I am assisted by Drew Fox, who will help me in particular with the technology. So, with that, by way of introduction, can I invite Mr. McIntosh to lead his first witness?
Yes, my lord. My first witness is Mr. David Watson of DMA Canyon.
Good morning, Mr. Watson. Good morning. Now, I believe you're prepared to affirm.
Yes.
Yes. Sitting where you are, could I ask you to repeat these words after me? I solemnly, sincerely, and truly
I solemnly, sincerely, and truly
declare and affirm
declare and affirm
that I will tell the truth,
that I will tell the truth,
the whole truth,
and
nothing but the truth.
nothing but the truth.
Now, Mr. Watson, as you probably understand, you're about to be asked questions by Mr. McIntosh. I anticipate that will certainly extend through the morning and may extend into the afternoon.
Okay.
We usually take a break about 11:30, and I'll leave it in the hands of Mr. McIntosh to say when that break should be. But if at any stage you want just to take a break, feel free to just give me an indication and we will break. So feel that you're in control of that situation.
Thank you.
The final thing, can I say, and I speak as someone whose hearing is not what it was, can I ask you to keep your voice up a little bit beyond? You should have the assistance of the microphones, but if you could perhaps speak a little louder, a little more slowly than you might otherwise. And I'll make the same request to Mr. McIntosh. Mr. McIntosh.
Thank you, my lord. Mr. Watson, could you give me your full name and your occupation?
David Watson, and I'm a Legionella consultant.
And what are your qualifications to be a Legionella consultant?
I've got 25, almost 30 years in experience in the industry, and I've done various training courses over that time just to get myself up to the level.
Well, before we go into that in detail, did you provide a statement to the inquiry?
I did, yes.
And are you willing to adopt that as part of your evidence?
Yes.
Thank you. Now, before we go into your background, I'd like to understand a little bit more about DMA Canyon itself.
Yeah.
What was your role in the company in the years following 2015?
My role is I'm one of the directors of the company.
And are there more than one director?
There was 3 directors of us, yes. It was myself, Mike Kinghorn, and Graham McCulley.
Right. Now, what's the nature of DMA Canyon's business?
We're water hygiene specialists, and we also have a specialist plumbing division, which when we make recommendations around Legionella, they can take those recommendations and alter water systems in order to bring them up to the standards that we advise.
So you can both investigate and assess, but also fix things?
Yes.
Right. And you mentioned that you've done various courses that had 25 years experience.
Yes.
But you're not a microbiologist.
No.
No. So what is the basis of your skill, knowledge and experience in respect to the management of water systems?
It's more at looking at how the water systems have been built and do they comply with the guidance like L8 and the SHTMs.
Right, we'll come back to L8 and SHTMs in a moment. And so I just want to understand where the limits of your experience are, and
Yes.
we might get to that at various points today, which seems a bit of an ungracious way of putting it, but we need to be clear. So is your experience in respect of water systems limited to particular types of water systems?
Mostly we look at domestic water systems. We have worked at other, like cooling towers and that kind of thing, but mostly in relation particularly to the hospital would be in domestic water systems.
So when you say domestic, you don't mean houses, you mean the
Hot and
hot and cold water
Hot and cold water systems within the hospital, yeah.
and the heating systems and that?
No.
Not heating systems.
Not heating systems.
Not heating systems, right. And are there any particular types of buildings that you're specialist to, or do you cover almost any type of building?
We cover pretty much any building which has water in it.
So you would cover an office block like this one?
Office blocks, schools, colleges, hospitals, all the way from the big hospitals all the way down to little clinics.
Right. Now, when it comes to microorganisms, are there a limited number of microorganisms that you would consider you have some skill and experience in respect of?
Yes.
So what are those?
The main ones we would deal with would be Legionella and some Pseudomonas. Now, there are, because of what we've been doing at the hospital, there are some other organisms we're starting to become familiar with, but there's very little in the way of actual guidance for how we treat with them. So we revert back to the guidance which is provided for Legionella and Pseudomonas.
So just to break that down, there's a limited number of microorganisms you have experience of.
Yes.
And that experience is rooted both in the guidance and in your experience.
Yes.
So if we go back to 2015, you wouldn't have then had experience in the other things that you've just mentioned.
No.
No. So you're really just at that point, Legionella and Pseudomonas.
Yeah.
Can you just help us to get us started this hearing? What is Legionella and why does it require to be managed?
Legionella is an organism which can live in water, and if it grows within the water system and then gets aerosolized in a shower or a spray of some description, and then it's inhaled, it can cause an infection in the lungs. So therefore it has to be managed. That we risk assess and look at these water systems in order to get them to the point where we limit the scope for that bacteria to grow within the water systems by keeping the water system, making sure the cold water's hot, the cold water's cold.
Right, so let's break that down. So there seems to be, from what you were saying, two parts to it. There's whether Legionella is in the water and how it gets out of the water.
But I think there's always going to be potential for it to be in the water because it's a naturally occurring organism. So I think therefore we always assume that there is a potential for the system to be contaminated. So therefore what we're trying to do is limit the opportunity for that organism to grow so that we don't have the conditions for growth within the water system.
And what are the conditions that Legionella would like?
They like water which is between 20 and 45 degrees. They like stagnant water, and they like water which has got nutrients in it which they can feed off of. So they want to keep water systems, hot water hot, cold water cold, and you want to keep the system clean.
We're going to get you to slow down a bit.
Sorry.
Because there's lots of people, you can hear them tapping.
Yes.
So the range it would like to be is between 20 and 45 degrees.
Yes.
And so you want to keep cold water under 20
Yes.
and hot water over 45.
Yeah, but the guidance will push you to 50 or 55 degrees.
Right.
To give us that little buffer.
So the guidance, you want to be over 50 or 55.
Yes.
Now, when it comes to Pseudomonas,
Yes.
why is the industry interested in regulating Pseudomonas?
Because I think, particularly in high risk settings, it can become a potential infection. Particularly, I think around line infections, but we only really look at that in the high risk environment.
So, what would be a high risk environment in your mind?
Like chemo-oncology or high dependency units.
So, in hospitals?
Yes. We don't routinely look at Pseudomonas out with the hospital environment.
And the thing you mentioned was line infections.
Yes.
Is this the lines that are fitted to patients who are receiving chemotherapy?
Yes.
Now, in various documents, in addition to yourself, there's another gentleman named Mr. Alan McRobbie.
Yes.
Who is he, or who was he in the company?
Alan worked for DMA, he left a few years ago. He was our compliance manager at the time of doing the risk assessments that we carried out.
Okay, well, we'll come back to him. The first document I want to take you to is SHTM 0401 Part B,
Yes.
which is a bundle 15, page 381. Now, obviously, it's a huge document.
Uh-huh.
Are you familiar with this document?
Yes.
Now, is this guidance or regulation? How do you see it as a document?
I don't know.
You don't know.
It's never been explained clearly in our industry whether this is legal guidance or whether this is just additional guidance over and above. L8 would be the main guidance.
So what's L8?
L8's the guidance that's put out by the Health and Safety Executive around Legionella. And then you have within the hospital industry, hospital environment, we have the SHTMs.
Mr. Watson, I think I heard exactly what you said, but I just want to know.
Yes, I was just going to ask you to slow down a bit.
Okay.
Because one of the things that happens when you give evidence is you get a little bit excited.
Okay, sorry.
So if you could slow down, I do it too. So a little bit slower. So you mentioned SHTM 0401 Part B
Yes.
as a document that you're not entirely sure whether it's guidance or regulation.
I don't know where it would stand legally.
But we're going to deal with that with other people.
Yes.
Right. Could I maybe just confirm that I heard correctly? The way you put it was it has never been explained in the industry as to whether it was legal guidance or something else. Thank you.
Yes, and so L8, I think we're going to talk about L8 a lot. So let me just check I understand it.
Yeah.
This is produced by the Health and Safety Executive.
Yes.
So it definitely is regulation.
Yes.
Yes. And what is an L8 risk assessment, therefore?
An L8 risk assessment is where we would look at a water system and we would go through the water system and how it's laid out and how it complies with the guidance provided by L8 and the support documents of HSG 274 and how the water system complies.
HSG 274, that's Health and Safety Guidance 274.
Yes, which is additional document which links to L8.
And that comes from the Health and Safety Executive as well. So these are the three documents that lie at the heart of your work.
Yes.
Right. Now, so I would interrupt you. What does an L8 risk assessment attempt to do?
It attempts to look at the water system and see that it complies with all of the guidance which has been provided within the various documents. And any areas where it's not complying, we try to make recommendations as to how the system needs to be amended or altered in order to bring it up to standard. But also looks at the PPM regime.
So what's PPM?
Planned preventative maintenance. It's
Planned preventive maintenance.
Yes, the tasks that you would need to carry out on a daily, weekly, monthly basis in order to maintain the water in the condition that we would like it to be in.
Right. We're going to come back to what actual L8 risk assessments looked at when we look at yours in a moment. I noticed, but I don't want to check whether this is a correct observation on my part, they're quite a structured document, a sort of formal structure. When we look at your ones, are they a standard structure for the industry, or is it your own particular way of structuring them?
I think ours would be built, but designed by us.
So it's your format. Now, we're interested in the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital and the Royal Hospital for Children. When a new building is built and is built by presumably a contractor and is supplied to an owner or an occupier, whose responsibility is it to obtain the first, what is called by some people, as I understand it, a pre-occupation L8 risk assessment?
I think that would come down to the contractual agreement between the builder and the owner. But eventually, as the owner takes the building, they would have a responsibility to make sure that they have a risk assessment in place in order for them to manage the water system going forward.
Right. So we'll ask other people about what this particular arrangement did, but your position is that you'd think this would come from the private arrangement between the parties.
Who would be responsible for having that carried out? I think so. Yes.
Right. And then you say that the organisation running the building would acquire a responsibility to check there'd been a risk assessment.
Yes, and then they would have to have one in place for going forward.
Okay. Now, within this SHTM 0401 Part B, I'd like to jump to page 418 in the bundle, which is a organogram of some sort. Now, I see this later in your reports, but I'd like to just go through who the various duties and parties are in this structure and try and understand who everyone is, because it can get a little bit confusing. So looking at this, at the top, this is a template, I'm assuming.
Yes.
It describes in this structure that the chief executive of whatever organisation it is the duty holder. What is the duty holder and what are they responsible for?
The duty holder is the person who's ultimately responsible for the water safety on site.
And why is that? Is that a whim of you, or does it come from somewhere official?
Sorry?
Does it come from somewhere official, that idea?
I think it's described within L8.
Okay. Now, working down the structure, we have in the middle, or to the right-hand side, actually, the top, an authorising engineer.
Yes.
Who's the authorising engineer?
Who is it?
Or, well, what's the purpose of an authorising engineer?
I think it provides independent guidance to the board on how to manage their water systems, and it provides technical guidance if they require it at any point.
But would this be for any water system in a hospital?
Yes.
Yeah. The second from the bottom, there's a role called authorised person water.
Yes.
In this structure, what are the duties of the authorised person water?
I think within the document it actually gives you the duties they have to carry out.
Yes.
But normally the person who's authorised water would be the person who on a day-to-day basis would be managing the water.
Yes, so it's the day-to-day role.
Yes.
Yeah. And then if we step up the structure, we then have a responsible person. And above the water safety group, which is in blue, we have a designated person.
Yes.
Now, would we find descriptions of their roles in this document?
I think that all the roles are described within the document.
But I want to just simply jump to the water safety group and understand what you understand its duties are. What's the purpose of having a water safety group in a hospital or a health board?
It's to allow all the different parties who have an interest in the water system to come together, and so that there's a group who are making the decisions on how to manage the water system, so that infection control and the clinicians can feed into that group, as well as the states and the likes of ourselves and the authorising engineer. All the people can come together so that all the parties who have an interest in the water system can feed
So
into
in practical terms, it's the primary decision-making body. Right. Now, when we look at all these people in this structure, is there any requirement on them to be trained?
Yes.
And how might they obtain such training?
There's various training organisations who specialise in providing training for our industry.
Normally external to Orca.
Most of it would be external, or they could maybe contract. Yeah, I think most of it would be external.
But if you ran a big organisation, you could run your own training.
If the hospital had the right people in order to do that training, I'm assuming they could, yeah.
Now, along this document, as we go on, we're going to meet some other concepts which I want to just check I understand. What is a written scheme in the context of water?
The written scheme's guidance, which is created specific to the water system on site, which again just goes through who's responsible for each of the tasks which have to be carried out, and detailing what tasks are required to be carried out for the planned preventative maintenance, when they need to be carried out, and who should be carrying those tasks out, and it just lays all of that out.
Again, Mr. Watson, this is entirely familiar. People speak it the way that they speak.
Yeah.
But when in normal conversation, somebody is not trying to take a note.
Sorry.
Now, I'm not looking for dictation, but I am finding, particularly it's really for Mr. McIntosh to establish the pace.
Yes, we'll slow down a bit.
And particularly when we come to a matter where the exact answer of the witness is important. I think if we could encourage Mr. Watson to speak a little bit slowly. Mr. Watson, you're in exactly the same position as almost every witness I've ever heard, because you get into a conversational mode.
Okay.
But this is going a little bit fast.
Yes, well, let's go back to the written scheme. So you describe the written scheme as setting out what everyone's responsibilities are. What is it you're trying to avoid by having a written scheme?
You're trying to avoid the water sorry, how would I put this? I think it's easier to describe what you're trying to achieve rather than...
Then happily do that.
Okay, what you're trying to achieve is that the water system is then managed and maintained properly so that we keep the water in the conditions we described earlier, that we don't have water which is out with parameters, and the checks are being carried out and the maintenance of the water system is being carried out so that the water system remains in a safe condition.
So in essence, it's a operational sort of guidance plan.
Yes.
So how does that differ from a water safety plan, which we will look at later this week?
I think they're very similar.
And do you have to have both, or can you just have one? Is there any particular rule?
I don't think there's any particular rules.
And what are you trying to achieve by a water safety plan?
Same thing.
Same thing, right. Now, we're also going to come across something called authorising engineer annual audits.
Yes.
Is this a thing you come across generally, or is it particularly to this hospital?
We see them in a lot of hospitals. It tends to be more in the hospital environment. We see the authorising engineering audits being carried out, but we don't see it just in Elizabeth. We see it across all the buildings we deal with in GG&C.
So from your point of view, what do you see as the objective of an authorising engineer's audit?
It's an independent review of the water management plan, or the water safety plan, so that it gives the board a chance to review their documentation and all the works that are being carried out, and does it still comply with what they're trying to achieve?
Now, when you're doing an L8 risk assessment for any hospital, what, if any, issues does it cause when there's no written scheme or water safety plan or authorising engineers report from your point of view?
For us, it highlights that there's nobody taking responsibility, or there's nothing in place to manage the water system, so that all the tasks that we would expect to be carried out on a daily, weekly, monthly basis are physically being carried out. There's no documented structure in place to ensure that's in place.
Okay, right. Now, I want to just understand, if I can, and if it is a matter of practice and it's not an absolute rule, then I hope you'll tell me. But I've got 4 things that I'm going to put to you that seem to me to be of interest, whether they occur. And I'd like to understand whether you can tell me whose responsibility it is, other than, I suppose, the duty holder, to do these things as they arise. But if it's a matter of just practice as opposed to, or even just informal practice, please say that. I don't want you to give the impression that there's a hard and fast rule when it isn't.
Okay.
The 4 things are this. Maintaining a management structure of this sort that we see on the screen in front of us. Ultimately, whose responsibility is to make sure this happens?
I think that would fall on the duty holder mostly. Now, they may delegate it down to the designated person,
right,
to ensure that's in place, but I think ultimately it should fall on the duty holder to make sure that you have this, the management structure in place.
An organisation might have a water safety plan or something that does that delegating.
Right, so answer to question 1 is designated person.
No, duty holder.
Duty holder, right.
But the organisation might have a water safety plan or some such document that sets out those delegations.
Yes.
Right. Obtaining a L8 risk assessment or whatever frequency is required, whose responsibility would that be?
Normally speaking, it would be somebody around the designated person, or possibly the responsible person who would approach us in order to do the risk assessment.
So somewhere in the middle?
Yes.
And is that just practice or is that guidance?
It gives you guidance within this document as to who is responsible for making sure that's in place.
And when it comes to reading and understanding and reacting to a risk assessment, who in this sort of structure in general responsibility would it be?
Mostly the responsible person and the authorised person to deal with the actual physical recommendations.
I see. Okay. Now, when it comes to ensuring that authorised persons and authorising engineers are appointed, whose responsibility would that be?
I think again this comes up to the duty holder and the designated persons to drive it down. It's the top of the tree.
And it might depend on the organisation's safety platform. Now, I'd like to start looking at
Sorry, Ms. McIntosh, the last question was your question 4?
whose responsibility is it to appoint authorising engineers and appoint authorised persons?
Thank you.
Now, Mr. Watson, what I'd like to do is to move on to how you become involved in this hospital.
Yes.
I wonder if you could be shown the next document, which is in Bundle 25, Document 40, page 669. So far, this is working. Now, we have received this from your organisation, I understand.
Yes.
Attached to an email.
Yes.
So this letter bears to be dated 15th December 2014, and it's addressed to Mr. Powery.
Yes.
And if we look at the next page, we see, or the third page actually, that the author is you.
Yes.
Right. We go back to the beginning. How was it that you came to write this letter?
We were already carrying out work at the Southern General Hospital, as it was known at the time. We were doing routine checks within the hospital in what's now referred to as the retained estate.
The retained estate?
Yes. We had no input into the new building going up. And Ian approached us as we were the kind of on-site LA contractor and asked if we could help him with getting a risk assessment carried out for the new building as part of the handover.
And this is your quote?
Yes.
Were you actually asked to carry out this work?
Yes, we completed.
Right. Now, when you were instructed to do the work, were you provided with access to the Zutec system?
We were given some limited access to the Zutec. I think they gave us access to just the water files that they thought would be relevant to us.
Okay. So I don't need to show you the next letter, that's helpful.
Ms. McIntosh, do you want just to explore so that everyone is keeping up? I'm sure everyone knows all about Zutec. But...
Well, that's my next question. So what is the Zutec system as you understand it?
It was an online records portal for us to access drawings and some of the commissioning records which were put in place that we needed to access in order to carry out the reviews for the risk assessment.
So were you able to find commissioning records for all the systems you examined?
There were some gaps in the commissioning records.
Are you able to give an idea of the proportion of gaps in the commissioning records?
Sorry, it was 9 years ago.
Yeah. Did you manage to obtain the information that wasn't there from elsewhere?
We inquired through Ian Powery for some additional records, some additional drawings, and I think eventually some of the information was provided, but I don't think everything we asked for was provided.
Did you ever come across any validations of the water system as opposed to commissioning?
In what way?
So I understand, and I'm sure I'll be corrected if I'm wrong, that sometimes in the construction of a building, the contractor might commission the system, but the client might validate it independently. Is that something you've ever come across in water?
I didn't see in this site.
Is it something you've come across then? Validation text?
Not domestic water systems. And when I've worked in heating systems and things like that, I've seen that kind of thing.
So you've seen it more in heating than in domestic hot and cold water?
Yes.
Right. Now, when you were on the site at this point, where would this have been, your first team on site to do this work?
I believe our very first visit to site was just before Christmas 2014, where I think we went in and we got the site induction in our passes to allow us to access the site. And then I believe our very first walk round of the site and actually getting into the building was maybe about a week or so after we returned after the Christmas holidays.
So in January,
In January.
2015. And so who was providing you with guides on site at that point? Was it?
The initial walk round was carried out by Mercury Engineering for us.
And as far as you understand, who are Mercury Engineering?
Mercury Engineering were the mechanical contractor who installed the plumbing system.
Did you receive any orientation and guidance from GGC staff in those initial visits?
Not in the initial visits, no. I think one of the GG&C staff came with us for part of the walk round, but as I say, it was 9 years ago, so I may be mistaken in that.
Now, at this point, when you're just being instructed, were you told who the duty holder, authorising engineer and authorised persons were at this point?
No.
No. Now, I'm going to try and ask you some broad questions about this system and Legionella assessments. What I wanted to understand is you looked at the water system of this hospital, the domestic water system. How was it designed to limit the growth of microorganisms as you understood it?
I think it was designed. We were advised that the tap selection was specifically designed to reduce the potential for growth by having TMT taps so that we didn't have the TMVs mounted further back within the system.
Right, so there's lots of jargon in there, Mr. Watson.
So the thermostatic mixing, which blends the hot water down to usable temperatures, was they selected taps which blended the water right at the tap, rather than blending the water maybe half a metre or a metre back from the tap.
So you actually have the hot and cold supplying the tap itself?
Yes.
And in the tap, you mix the two?
You mix it there, and it distributes at around 41 degrees at the tap, rather than having the TMV mounted back with it behind the panels and then coming down to the tap where you maybe have a metre or something like that.
At a lower temperature?
At a lower temperature, which is in the growth range for Legionella.
Right.
So there were things like that. The hot water clarifiers were designed to run, we were advised, at 60 degrees, which is standard, but they were also designed that the return temperatures coming back to the clarifiers should be at 55 degrees, which is, again, higher than most guidance.
And what did you understand to be, from the point of view of the design of the system, to be the primary means of controlling Legionella in the building?
Temperature.
Temperature. What sort of other means are there?
You could dose, background dosing systems such as chlorine dioxide could be installed.
We'll come back to that later.
Yes,
yeah.
But
what other
you could do that, and there is filtration units between the raw water tanks and the post-filter tanks, which filter the water and take out particulate. So that should stop any particulate getting into the post-filter tanks, providing nutrients getting through the tanks and into the system to provide nutrients.
Okay, well, we'll come back to both of those later on. Do you have any views about whether water in a hospital that's supplied in the domestic system could ever be sterile?
I don't think it could be, no.
No, okay. And we also read about the concept of wholesome water.
Yes.
What do you understand by wholesome water?
Wholesome water being water that is fit for using for drinking, washing, and it's not going to cause any harm.
Does wholesome mean the same thing in all contexts, or does it mean different things depending who's using the water?
I would just assume wholesome is always the same.
Because you mentioned high-risk places in hospital.
Yes.
Is there any extent to which wholesome might impose a higher standard in a high-risk area? In
the high-risk areas, when we're doing sampling, the thresholds for what would constitute an out-of specification is tighter.
So
yes.
You're just saying that if you do sampling
yes.
in a high-risk area, the threshold at which you would consider it to be out of specification would be set at a higher level.
Yes.
Or in a sense, it's almost a lower level, in that you react more promptly.
Yeah, I see what you mean. It's the control parameters are tighter.
Tighter, yes, than you would elsewhere in a hospital.
Yes.
Right. Okay. Now, I don't know whether this is going to be important, and if you can't remember.
Just so we can be clear, although I think your answer was clear, Ms. McIntosh introduced the concept of wholesome water and then asked, does it depend on context? You then gave an answer in relation to high-risk areas. In a high-risk area, a lower tolerance of, as I understand it, the concentration of microorganisms.
Yes.
However, going back to the start, to understand that wholesome water is probably statutorily defined and certainly means the same. Wholesome means the same in every context.
So that's what you're saying.
Yeah, the definition, when people talk about wholesome water, they mean the standard water.
Yeah. What comes up from the main supply?
What's supplied by Scottish Water, which would be deemed fit for drinking.
Got that. Thank you. That's really helpful. Look, it may not matter, but do you know whether your staff were on site on the 26th of January 2015 when the hospital was signed for and handed over?
I honestly can't remember.
But you're in and around the building in that month?
We were in and around the building at that time, but even if we were on site, we had no... We played no part in the actual physical handover of the building. Or
Right. Could we ask you to go to bundle 25, document 51, which is at page 755. So this is an email that appears to be from your Mr. McRobbie to Mr. Powery, copied to you on the 9th of January 2015. And he describes having a walk around the day before and that he was impressed by the general standard of installation. I just wanted to know, in case I'm just being foolish, what is a PO in the third sentence?
purchase order.
Purchase order. Just getting paid. Fine,
Very much, yeah.
There's so many, we just wanted to make sure we understood that one. Right. I need to turn to your report itself, which is in bundle 6, page 122. It might be worth you having a copy in front, your copy in front of you, because this is a big document. So that's bundle 6, page 122. Now,
Ms. McIntosh, there's the document and a document number. I've got the page, I've got the bundle.
it's document number 28.
28, thank you.
Now, when I put it, 28. Sorry, it is 29. 29, I'm being corrected. Now, what I was proposing to do from now for the next sort of 45 minutes is to walk through this report.
Okay.
And I suppose I'm going to end up looking at bits that you think are less important than others, and there may be places where I point at something and you think it appears in more detail somewhere else.
Okay.
So I don't want you to hesitate from saying, actually, there's more later on, or there's less, because we can obviously read this report, and I'm assuming, in a sense, it's for a lay audience.
Sorry?
This is really for a lay audience, the duty holder.
We try and make it as easy to understand as we can, but there will be jargon in there.
Well, indeed, we're going to have a go at that. So you've already described what the purpose of an L8 risk assessment is. So I want to just look at the bottom of the front page and understand, because this appears over your later reports, might be important. So on this particular report, you're describing that the site survey was completed on the 29th of April 2015. And it was issued as a draft document for comment by NHS Estates.
Yes.
Now, and you mentioned continual review recommended during occupation period. Is there a frequency at which it is considered to be prudent to carry out the reviews of these risk assessments?
Most risk assessments should live as a live document and should be, if any changes come up, then you should review your risk assessment. If there's any significant changes to your water system, review the risk assessment and make any changes to the risk assessment as you go through it as a live thing. But most organisations will put a limit of 2 years, for example, and say every 2 years we will come back and we will review the document.
But that's practice, not guidance
It's
already.
practice, not guidance. The guidance says it should live as more or less as a live document.
Okay. Now, what I want to do is go onto page 123. Now, the reason I wanted to go here was a couple of things. Firstly, to identify the data final assessment, which we have as 29th of April 2015, third the way down, and the names of the people to whom the report was commissioned by. So that's a bit further down on this screen. So it states here that the report was commissioned by Ian Parry of NHS Estates and issued to him.
Yes.
Now I'm going to come back to how that issuing was done later in detail. But I want to just look at the footnote. As a lawyer, this reads like a sort of caveated statement by you that sort of qualifies your opinion by reference to what you've seen. So can you explain the purpose of this footnote?
Basically, it's saying that we don't know this building, we're not familiar with the building, and we can only assess what we are showing. Is what we're basically saying. If the hospital tell us this is where parts of the water system are, and they take us to review that, then that's what we can review. We can't just walk around the entire building, it's particularly a building of that size, and see absolutely everything that's going on. So it's just us saying, if you show us something, we can assess it. If you don't show us or you don't tell us something, there's not really much we can do.
So if you're not taken to a particular floor, you can't assess that floor.
Or if we're advised there's nothing on that floor, there's no reason for you to go there, then we wouldn't go to that floor and review it.
But you might ask.
We might ask, yes.
Because you might be suspicious about where the other plant room is, for example.
Yes.
That's right.
Ah.
And in this case, you would have been shown all the plant rooms.
We were, yes.
Yes, right. Now, if we could go to page 134, because we jumped past your own certifications and qualifications, I think it'd be better if we stayed at the whole page just for the moment rather than jumping in. Your structure of your reports, Mr. Watson, have a lot of bits that look like executive summaries and they sort of repeat in structure. So I'm always worried that I'm not looking at the right page. But
okay.
Is this the executive summary from the whole report? Page 134. Now, are you working off your own copy?
Yeah, I'm just taking up the page numbers off the bottom.
Right, have you got numbers in the top right-hand corner?
I printed off my own copies.
Oh, well,
so I'm using the reference you've got in the bottom right, which is our documents, which makes sense to me.
Page 13 of 18.
Yeah, I've got it.
Right, yes, okay. This is going to be fun, but we'll get there. Right. First things first, I want to just check how many water systems are there in domestic? Is there one system for the whole hospital, or is it divided up into sections?
It's effectively one large system which supplies the entire RHC and adults hospital.
Do you have any views about whether that's a sensible approach, or is there views on this?
I don't design water systems, so...
Fair enough. Okay. Now, if we go on 2 pages, we reach another table headed Risk Assessment Summary. Now, I'm going to stop here and go through some of this in detail. 5th line down, you ask the question, is building used by potentially at-risk groups?
Yes.
And then you answer, yes, persons with acute medical conditions.
Yes.
What did you understand to be the at-risk groups that were in this hospital?
Well, we were aware that when the building was occupied, there was going to be hemo-oncology, there's going to be high dependency units. So there were going to be people who were immunosuppressed and had basically underlying health conditions.
And then the next section is there a history of Legionella colonisation of the water system on site? I'm assuming this is for an old building. This would be more important. Yes. You would describe the history of the site.
Yes.
Now, In the middle of that section, there's a paragraph that begins, DMA were advised sampling being carried out. Were you given any information about, or would it be normal practice to be given information about the sampling methodology that was used for this exercises that are described here?
Normally, we would expect to see within the written scheme documentation for a building the method statements for carrying out the various tasks. So yes, we would have expected to see that methodology, and with this being carried out as part of the handover, we would have liked to have seen the methodology to see whether they were doing first flush, post flush sampling. There's different terms.
But you didn't see the methodology?
No, we didn't see it.
And there was in fact no written scheme? No. If you go down to the next box.
My fault, Mr. McIntosh, can I, you made the point about no written scheme. Mr. Watson did not see the
Methodology for sampling.
right. Yes, I think it's, I just don't immediately have in my mind the notion of what a methodology might be.
Well,
to see it.
Yes, so you mentioned, Mr. Watson, that the concept of first flush. Can you just explain to us the different ways you might sample a tap?
Okay.
Yeah, you can either take first flush samples, which is literally where you don't run the tap whatsoever, and you take the first half litre or litre of water into a bottle, and that gets shipped off for analysis. Or you can take post flush samples, which is where you would maybe disinfect the outlet and then flush it for a period, and then take the sample, and that gets sent off.
And is there a difference between where the water you're sampling is actually coming from when you do these two different methods?
Yeah, the first flush sample lets you know the water which is effectively living in the tap and the first metre or so back from the tap. And when you do the post flush sample where you flush it for a period, then you're sampling further back in and you're actually getting like the bulk water within the water system. So there are different reasons for taking the samples.
So in effect, it's different methodologies for different outlets will collect different classes of water effectively.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Now, in the row that we're just displaying on the screen here saying Legionella management, you've recorded there was no formal management structure, written scheme, or communication protocols. And there were significant communications issues between parties involved. Yeah. From your recollection, what are the significant communications issues that you are identifying here?
The things that we picked up on around that were we identified a clarifier being offline at one point. We identified there was a bypass system put in place, and when we returned to site, they had been corrected, and estates didn't seem to know who had done the work.
So you identified two problems.
Yeah, those are just examples.
On an early visit.
Yes.
And then you return and the problems have been corrected. But you don't know who corrected them.
When we asked the states about it, there didn't seem to be any communication around when those were fixed and how they were fixed and what was carried out.
So this is more a record keeping issue in a sense.
Potentially, yeah, and it's just, we were advised that there were times when the different parties weren't talking to each other and they were working to their own schedule.
In this concept, when you mean different parties, do you mean different people in estates or different companies?
The builders and the main contractor and the NHS.
Right. And in the absence of a formal management structure, a written scheme, or communication protocols, you've assessed this as a high risk.
Yes.
And we'll come back to what that means in a moment. And section 9 tells us more, I think. Could we go on to page 137, which will be 2 pages further on, one page further on. Back 1 page, please. Thank you. Now, I think if I do this right, we can avoid looking at a lot more of the document by just drilling in here.
Okay.
And in a sense take it a little bit quicker. Let's deal with the top box. CWST means what?
Cold water storage tank.
So in this system, the water comes in from the two external sources into a raw water storage tank.
Sorry?
A raw water storage tank.
Yes.
And then it goes to cold water storage tanks.
No, they're all water. They're all cold water storage tanks. They're all water. Essentially, how it was the terminology which was provided to us. So we just carried on with the terminology. That's the water which just comes directly from Scottish Water town mains, goes into 4 water tanks. It then comes out of those, goes through filtration units, and then goes into the post-filter water tanks, which at the time they referred to as the bulk water.
So all of the raw water and the bulk water are the cold water storage
Yes.
tanks. So we should read this row as referring to all the tanks.
Yes.
Including the trades tank.
Yes.
Right. And they're all located in the basement tank room.
Yes.
Now, there's a suggestion that one of the tanks is isolated.
Yes.
Why would that be an issue for you as an L8 risk assessor?
Because what we then end up with is where the valve, the mains line to that tank would have been isolated, it then leaves a section of pipework, maybe about 10 metres, 5 metres, something like that, of pipework, which is now no longer having water drawn through it.
But it's still got water in it.
It would probably still have water in it, but then the water, that it would stagnate if it's off for a considerable period of time. And the water tank 1A itself, which is now no longer having water made up to it, the water within that tank could start to stagnate as well.
And when you get a tank that's been separate for a period,
Yes.
what's the method to remove any risks caused by it being separate?
Normally we would recommend that you drain, clean and disinfect the tank and then refill it with fresh water and put it back online once the problem's been identified and this tank can actually be put in use.
And when you do that, do you need to record that you've done that?
Yes.
And why is that?
Just to show that you've carried out the work in the correct way and that the work has actually been done, because if we're reporting that there and nobody records it, then we have no way of knowing whether we drew stagnant water in.
I want to say that record keeping seems important in water management.
Yes, it is.
Right. Now, moving on to the section headed NB. Now this, no, you've gone too far. NB in the top box. You mentioned this observation that there is no separate dedicated supply to renal or other medical systems.
Yes.
Repeatedly through all your reports.
Yes.
And clearly you feel it's important to mention it. Why is this important to explain?
It's just when the renal systems are very tightly managed and the water within the renal systems can come into contact with blood, patient blood, as far as I understand. And so therefore, if there's a supply going to the renal systems, which is attached onto the rest of the domestic water system, we need to be very careful if we're introducing any disinfectants into that water system, that the renal department would be well aware of that and there was no potential for the disinfectant to be drawn through into the renal system without them being aware of it.
It's both that you're worried potentially that the disinfectants in the domestic water could get to the renal patients.
Yes.
But you're also worried that blood from the renal patients could get back into domestic water.
No,
not
that's less of an issue.
That's less of an issue, right? Okay.
In fact,
Now,
I don't know that would be an issue at all.
in fact, you haven't mentioned it, but you just mentioned it briefly then. That's fine. Now, in the second box on this page, if we could scroll up, headed chlorifiers. Now, from the point of view of us as domestic users in our own homes, we don't have chlorifiers, we'll probably have a gas boiler.
Yes.
So a chlorifier takes hot water and it uses it to heat other water to the necessary temperature.
Yes.
It's a heat exchanger.
Yes, but the way the chlorifiers work, and they're not actually true chlorifiers, they're actually storage vessels but we've got an external plate heat exchanger.
Right, now that was far too fast. So you're going to have to slow that down.
The chlorifiers on site are actually just large storage vessels for the hot water, But the way the water's heated is there's an external plate heat exchanger attached to each chlorifier, which pulls the cold water into it, heats that water, and then puts it into
So in fact, the heat exchanger and the chlorifier together are in fact a chlorifier system.
It works as a system, as a
Right.
chlorifier.
Now, in this section, the second paragraph, you described there were various issues with the chlorifiers.
Yes.
Now, can you explain to me whether, firstly, what these issues were and whether they were issues that were resolved or whether they remained?
On the date we referenced on the 21st of April, there were issues at the energy centre, we understand, and there wasn't enough sufficient heat being provided from the energy centre on site into the main building, and so the chlorifier temperatures all dropped. I think if you looked at section 6, you would see a lot of the chlorifiers came down to the region of in the mid-40s was the storage temperatures that we were picking up at that time, and so that was a concern for us.
So this particular problem has the potential to be an intermittent or occasional or a one-off problem? You don't know?
Yeah, we don't know, but at the time, it could just have been part of the teething problems of opening a new building. I don't know.
But you didn't know then?
No, we just highlighted there was an issue and we weren't getting the temperatures, so we highlighted it onto.
What would be the way of satisfying yourself that it was just a problem on the day? Could you have done that?
We went back the following week and we checked, and the majority of the chlorifiers had all come back up to the temperatures that we would expect to see.
So this particular set of risk calculations in this table
Yes.
are the 21st of April alone?
No.
No.
It's a combination of what we saw on the 21st and what we saw on return visits when the chlorifier temperatures were where they seemed to be set at.
So I don't want to provide you with two choices here.
Mm-hmm.
So choice one, which is the description of risk that you're recording at the bottom of this box, is an aspect of a single moment when something might have gone wrong, which as far as you can see was fixed,
mm-hmm.
or something that you observed more than once during your visit and worried you for the future in a sort of persistent way. Is it one of those two things or something else?
When we actually, if you look at section 6, you would see we had a couple of chlorifiers which were offline, and some of the chlorifiers, even when the energy centre would seem to be back up and running, still weren't achieving the full temperature we would have expected to see. So therefore, it's the entire assessment that we did on those chlorifiers.
So it's more than just a one-day thing?
Yes, it's not just a single snapshot in time.
Okay. If we could go on to the next page, please. At the top of the next page. You see how the third line down, the cold water temperatures recorded by DMA vary considerably, with the majority being more than 5 degrees higher than those recorded at water tanks, and the peak temperatures of 30 degrees being noted.
Yes.
Now, I wanted just to check, firstly, is that a observation about the whole inspection or about just this event on the 21st of April?
No, that's referring to the cold water temperature, so that wouldn't really have been impacted by the events of the 21st of April.
Okay. So what's the problem having peak temperatures of 30 degrees or 5 degrees over?
There's two things there. The 30-degree temperature is telling us that you've got a lot of heat gain in the system. So the cold water, in January, we would normally expect to see the cold water temperature coming into the building around 7 or 8 degrees, if not even a little bit colder. And so all of a sudden we're going from that and we're recording temperatures at outlets which are 20 degrees higher.
Now, I know you don't design water systems.
Yes.
But in general terms, what are the sorts of methods by which cold water can gain heat in a building like a hospital?
Lack of use, be it running within risers beside heating pipework. Just if the building's warm and the water's not being used, it'll just come up to the ambient temperature of the building, and it is quite a warm building.
So it's a series of different possible causes, some of which are potential design issues, some of which are just operational.
Yes.
But all you're doing is flagging this.
Yeah, all we're doing is flagging that we're saying there's heat gain on the cold water system, and it's getting up when we get to 30 degrees, it's coming up into the range where Legionella and other bacteria can grow.
The next sentence, additional control measures onwards. I read this as you observing this might be related to the fact that at this point the building wasn't fully occupied.
Yes.
And could it be that this is just a passing thing that goes away?
Based on my experience of what happened after, when we went back and looked at the building a couple of years later, a lot of the cold water temperatures were within parameters. And so it could just simply be that the building wasn't in full use, and when it went into use and you had the throughput of water that we needed, it brought the temperatures back into line.
We've discussed a lot about temperatures, both in the hot and the cold water systems. Were you at this point shown temperature records from sampling being or data collection systems for the hospital that could show you what the temperatures were over days you weren't there?
We, as a reference at the very top of it, we did see some records from the commissioning phase and by the state staff, and our temperatures appeared, according to this statement, I can't remember, but our statement says that they're in line with what we were seeing with the records that were provided to us.
Okay, that's helpful. Now, would you take your own temperatures beyond these ones on the day? Would you? I'll rephrase that. You obviously took some temperatures.
Yes.
If you see out of range temperatures, does that cause you to go back and check again and again and again, or do you just warn people?
But because of the size of the building, there was no option for us to go back and redo temperatures over and over and over. So we highlight that we are seeing these temperatures, and if you go to section 7, you'll see the amount of temperatures we took.
Yeah.
And therefore we highlight that if it was a single temperature, then we would possibly went back and double checked that, but we were seeing this in multiple areas, and so it wasn't a one-off temperature that we saw at spec, it was consistently across the building.
But in effect, you're really a warning system here.
Yes.
So you're just saying, here's a problem. And somebody else has to fix it.
Yes.
Right. Now, I'd like to jump forward to page 141, if that's possible, which is the second page of your section 2, Mr. Watson. So I'd like to understand a little bit more about your risk categories, because we're going to come across them a bit more as we go through this document. Now, firstly, this table here, is this your creation or has it come from somewhere?
It's been adapted from other documents, but it's our table, but we have adapted it from other.
And what are you trying to achieve by using this sort of language and these descriptions and providing this detail?
What we're trying to do here is, when we make a recommendation, we're trying to prioritise for the NHS what are the issues that we've identified that we think you need to deal with in the order, and how we prioritise.
Okay, so let's look, just because it's at the top, at remedial action category 1. And obviously we can read that, but when you say senior management action required, who are the senior management in your mind?
That would be, if you go back to the table you had, that would be like the responsible person.
Responsible person?
Yeah.
Right, okay. Now, the next, in the fourth line of that category is, third line, sorry, recommendations within this category should be carried out immediately / as soon as reasonably practical. What do you mean by as soon as reasonably practical?
As soon as you can physically get to fix that problem.
And so you're trying to give an impression of urgency?
Yes.
Right. And indeed, that's the title of the second
Yes.
category. From your experience in 25 years, do people ever have any difficulty understanding these risk assessment criteria?
No, not significantly, no.
Now, we're going to now walk through the report, and I worry now that you're on the wrong pages. So
Okay.
I think what we have to do is ask you to stick to the screen,
Okay.
unless you feel strongly about it. Could we go, please, to page 146? Now, I picked on this page because it had a lot of red in it, and I wanted to understand what you're saying. I'm not particularly going to drill down into which plant room that is and where it's going. It's more to understand the message you're trying to get across. Could we look perhaps at the first row? So you've got a narrative here in recommendation. And is this one of those ones that was out of spec on the 21st of April?
Yes, it was. But
And then you-
you can see it's actually a bank of clarifiers.
So it's 3 in a row.
It's 3 clarifiers. The way the clarifiers are set up on site, each of the clarifier, it's a bank of 3 clarifiers feeding an area.
Yes.
They're all set up in the same way. So where we refer to O1, O2, O3 in that way, it's actually saying that affects that entire clarifier bank.
Okay. And so this particular one, you've identified an out of temperature issue, you flagged it as important, and you've explained why, and you've gone back on the 27th of April.
Yes.
Right. And therefore it still requires action.
Yes. It's saying, if you look at the bottom, they're saying the central clarifier, which would be number 2, the temperature was still lower than we would have expected to see.
And that's indeed the next row.
Yes.
So you've provided more detail.
Yes.
I get the impression from reading this that the remedial action categories are trying to draw the eye, and this is where you find out the detail.
Yes.
Right. Now, if we could just...
Sorry, can I just explain? Section 2 of our document is where we collate all the recommendations we make going through the document, and we try and collate all the recommendations together into this one document.
Well, that's why I'm going there, because I thought that was helpful. What I wanted to do was to go forward to page 146. So this appears to be a repeat. Oh, it's already been there, sorry, 147. 147. So effectively, is this you doing the same thing for the next few clarifiers?
Yes.
Right. And what is it you want the authorized person or the estates people or the duty holder or the responsible person to do when reading this table?
We would be looking for them to understand what caused the problem, and are they able to put something in place to prevent the problem happening again, or if it does happen again, that it gets automatically flagged to them that there is an issue.
Now, there's a few things that seem important, which I know hopefully don't need to take to you, but it, I think, confused us. We should have asked in your statement, but we didn't. You talk about pipe screens at various points.
Pipe screens.
Now, can we go to the foot of page 144? Or screened vents?
Yes.
Second bottom row. I think, yes, stay out of it, that's pretty perfect. What's a screened vent?
It's basically just a mesh that you put across the overflow screen or the warning pipe screen, which prevents any insects or anything crawling up and getting into the water.
And what's a warning pipe?
It's like a mini overflow, which just before the tank would overflow and flood the area would just give you a warning that we're getting to the point where the tanks are close to overflowing.
I think we probably should have known that without asking you today, but it's helpful to get the answer. And insects crawling in, is that a real risk with pipework in a domestic water system?
We've seen birds and rats sent in water tanks and be drowned in the water tanks. Not in the hospital, but we've seen that.
But it's a risk you have to manage.
It's a risk it's a risk you have to be aware of. Yes.
Okay. Now, on the same page, I'm not going to take you to the row unless you need it. There's discussion about single entry expansion vessels.
Yes.
Now, could you explain your concern about single entry expansion vessels? Because you mentioned that repeatedly throughout the
Are
document.
you able to scroll?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit further up. There's the next page, sorry. Page 145. Second row. So what is your concern about these expansion vessels? I know it's only been graded to 3, but you do mention it relatively frequently.
What we're looking for on expansion vessels is the water should enter the bottom of the expansion vessel. It's there to take up expansion within the water.
So as water heats up, it expands.
Yes. These ones here are relating to the cold water storage tanks. They would technically be accumulator vessels rather than expansion vessels. But it's just as the water expands within the system, it just takes up that expansion within the system, and the water should enter through the bottom and exit through the top, so that the water's always flowing through it. The way that it's normally done is the expansion vessel sits off on a dead leg to the side, and there's a lot of times where the water stagnates within.
So effectively, your concern is that these ones, both in the hot and cold systems,
Yes.
were on a side arm,
Yes.
and water expanded into them, and then comes out, or sometimes doesn't.
Doesn't generally come out. Now the one with the accumulator vessels, there's our plumber Graham would he would advise me that it's very, very difficult to fit a flow through accumulator vessel.
But it is possible to fit expansion vessels,
Expansion vessels in the hot, and they are now
which isn't
changed.
this section,
Sorry?
which isn't this page. I'm on the wrong page for that.
Yeah, on the chlorifiers, they were actually swapped out in 2019 to be the flow through
Well,
vessel.
that was going to be my question. So just to recap this, in the hot system, there were single entry expansion vessels,
Yes.
which have now been, in 2019, swapped out, as far as you understand.
Yes.
Right, that's very helpful. Now, we want to go to page 155, please. And I want to talk to you about chlorine dioxide, which you mentioned earlier. Now, you mentioned earlier that the water system's primary means of control was temperature, and I asked you about alternatives, and you mentioned dosing systems, and you said chlorine dioxide. So, in the third row of this page, you have described, or could you read out the recommendation box for the third row?
Due to the temperature deviations from the control parameters noted during the commissioning and handover phase and out of specification NHS microbiological sampling results, DMA would recommend fitting supplementary control systems, e.g. background dosing such as chlorine dioxide, in order to maintain microbiological control and or biofilm monitors such as Biosense Sensors Controller to assist in focusing remedial actions onto identified areas of microbiological activity.
Now, there's a lot in there. I want to just take you through that before we have a break. Firstly, you're mentioning chlorine dioxide here in this report in 2015. The hospital doesn't actually fit one until 2019. 18, sorry.
Late 18.
Late 18, early 19. So because you're early, I'm going to ask you lots of questions. Firstly, just in passing, what is a biosensor or controller?
They were sensors that we were with guys trying to sell us them at the time. I don't think we ever actually fitted them, but they were a way that you could actually install a probe into the system, and they would allow biofilm to form on them, and then they could give you an indication as to how much biofilm was going to grow on those sensors, and that gave you an...
So it's almost an electronic means to record biofilm?
Yes.
Now, you didn't buy any, but you were just...
We never actually installed any. It was just people were advising that these were available in the market. So we said, these are an option that you could consider.
So let's focus on the rest of it then. Okay. Why... It seems from a layperson's unusual to suggest this. So why are you suggesting it at this point?
Because we were seeing quite a lot of temperature deviation away from what we would hope to see based in the SHTM and the L8 guidance. And therefore, we would want to put additional control in place to help prevent microbiological growth. We've installed chlorine dioxide in a number of buildings, including at the Southern General at the time. There's a couple of other buildings where we had chlorine dioxide installed.
So that's in the retained estate?
Yes, and the results from that were very good. And so therefore we were just saying this is an option that you should consider in order to help.
Now I want to show you a section from SHTM 0401 Part B. This is Bundle 15. Don't get rid of this page, but we'll stick it in front of it. Bundle 15, page 337, which we were at before. And make sure I'm in the right place. Yes, so this seems to be a section in SHTM 401 Part A, sorry. Are you familiar with this document? And do you see how 15.1 discusses wholesomeness in water?
Yeah.
In the first paragraph. And then there's a second sentence. Second paragraph. I wonder if you could read it out and I'll ask you about it.
The introduction of chemical treatment to the potable water supply is an admission that the physical installation and/or management process is incapable of maintaining that water supply in a wholesome condition.
Now, to the extent that you have expertise in this, and if you don't, please tell me that you don't. Would you agree or disagree with that sentence? That's that view expressed in the guidance.
I wouldn't fully agree with it. Sometimes I think it's good to have it there as a belt and braces approach.
Right. And so why wouldn't you fully agree with it?
You can put it in as a precaution to help manage the water system. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have completely lost control, but if you install it earlier, and actually if you go later within the document, it talks about that this is an option which could be considered for new buildings.
So when you recommended this, were you seeing it as a precaution or as an admission?
A bit of both. We were already seeing some issues with the water system, and therefore if this was introduced at that point, then it could help manage the water system.
So it was a bit of precaution and a bit of admission from your
but that we'd already seen some temperatures out of spec. Yeah.
Okay. Well, if we could go back, please, to the bundle 6 page we were on before. I want to just look at the middle row on this page, domestic hot water systems, before we have a break. Now, just want to check. This is not discussion of the 21st of April issue. This is a different problem or the same problem repeated?
Distribution. That's the distribution temperatures. That's what we're seeing at outlets.
So this is where you're measuring the temperature effectively at the tap.
Yes.
Or rather at the temperature mixing element within the tap. And
how would prior to that?
Just prior. How would you get that sample?
If it's a direct hot tap, you physically just turn the tap on and you can measure the temperature of the water coming out. If it's feeding a thermostatic mixing valve, then we would take the temperature directly from the pipework prior to the mixing valve.
So you'd actually go and attack, there'll be a sampling point with that?
It's just on the pipework, and we've just got contact probes on thermometers.
You just measure the pipework?
Yeah.
You don't touch the water at all?
No.
Excellent.
No. You need to run the tap in order to get the hot water drawn through to the tap. We would have recorded the temperature at the tap because that's how we'd get the cold temperature and the blended temperature. But to get the hot at the TNTs, then there's no way that...
Is this another example of an area where method statements are important?
Can be, yes.
Yeah, okay. Now, I think probably we've gone a little bit further. I think. Could you go on to page 163 of the bundle?
Just before
Sorry.
we do that, Mr. McIntosh, we've been looking at the third row.
Can we go back to 155, please?
Yes, on
154.
155.
155, sorry.
And due to temperature deviations from control parameters, now and out of specification NHS microbiological sampling results. Now, it may be that you're going to come back to that.
I can deal with it here, and I probably should do.
My question really is what Mr. Watson was told or carried out or did.
So, Mr. Watson, you've explained in terms of temperature readings that you had access to some temperature readings done as part of commissioning and by estates. Yes. What are these microbiological sampling results that you are just touching on here in this box?
Sorry.
So this is page 155, which is page 2 of 41 on your system. And it's the third line of the third box.
We were advised that the NHS, when they were doing sampling across the building for the different departments being ready to move in, we were advised that they were recording some samples were coming back out of specification.
Okay, well, there's probably one more thing before we break, which is when we come back, I'm going to ask you about what contamination means in the context of the water system. Yeah. So while you're having a cup of tea or come a break, have a think about that, and we'll pick that up after a short break.
All right. As I said, Mr. Watson, we'll take a break, allow people to stretch the legs and have a cup of coffee. If we could try to be back by quarter 12. Please, man.
But, Mr. Watson, before we stop for the break, I asked you to think about what it means to say that water is contaminated.
Yes.
And I was thinking about how to structure the questions, and it occurred to me that, from your point of view, does the question, what does it mean that water is contaminated, have a different meaning in different contexts, or is it always one thing in your own mind?
It does have a different context for us. When we talk about water being contaminated, we would think of that as something artificially being introduced to the water system. So when we talk about bacterial contamination, we would talk about colonisation of the water system, because these are naturally occurring organisms and they're growing within the water system. So
you're talking about quantity?
not necessarily. Like, if we think about contamination, that would be if chemical gets drawn into the system.
Well, let's go back and start with Legionella.
Yes.
So you've mentioned that Legionella is naturally
Yes.
occurring. When is it that you would say, if you ever would, that a water supply was contaminated with Legionella?
We would refer to it as colonised.
Colonized.
Yes.
So you wouldn't use contaminated to talk about microbiological things?
No, but the terms do sort of become interchangeable.
Right, well, we'll come back to that problem next. Let's talk about when you would use contaminated. So would you use contaminated for a chemical that shouldn't be there?
Yes.
And if someone spilt a chemical into a raw water tank, then it would be contaminated?
Yes.
Would you use contaminated to deal with solid objects like sponges or pigeons or?
I don't think we would use that terminology. If we see something in the water tank, we wouldn't say that it was contaminated. It's not the terminology we would use. We would just describe it as there are objects in the water tank.
So your world of Legionella L8 assessment, contaminated is generally non-biological.
Yes.
But colonized is the word you would prefer to use for the biological stuff.
Yes, but they can sometimes be interchangeable. But that, in my head, that's how we normally separate them.
Given that you said in your early part of evidence that Legionella is naturally occurring,
yes.
When, from your point of view, does a water system become colonized / contaminated with Legionella? Is there a threshold in your mind?
Effectively, we would consider it colonised when we pick up in microbiological sampling in any level. We would say at that point we now have Legionella in the water system and we should address it.
So when it comes to a question that I might ask you, I'll ask you a question, I'll ask you whether you're the right person to answer it.
Okay.
And if you don't think you're the right person to answer it, I'll go and find the right person.
Okay.
So we were just looking at the document we were just looking at, page 155. And we said, and you used the word out of specification NHS microbiological sampling.
Yes.
Now I'm assuming you wouldn't have set the specification.
No.
No. And you're not a microbiologist.
No.
And presumably those weren't Legionella pseudomonas samples, as far as you remember.
From memory, there were...
Page 155, below.
Sorry?
Page 155.
Yeah, I've got 155. Yeah. I was just reminding myself whether there was a reference to Pseudomonas or Legionella, and there's not.
But from memory, what do you think it was?
There were samples. I don't remember Pseudomonas samples being taken as part of the handover phase, but I remember there were Legionella samples and there were also potable water samples taken.
Right. But you're just being generic.
Generic there that the NHS had identified to us that they had out of specification results.
But so either would you not do it, or are you the right person to describe what that out of specification as contaminated, or is that just not how you talk?
We wouldn't say that's a contaminated water system, it's just not the terminology.
Not the term. We'll ask somebody else. That's really helpful. Let's move on to, could you please go to page 163 of this document? I just want to touch in about the trades system.
Yes.
In the fifth line down of this page, where you talk about bib taps, irrigation points, and the 12th floor helipad fire suppression system. Now, why would it be necessary to flush and worry about the trade system? It's not going into people or anywhere near them, presumably.
When you've got bib taps, then you can connect hoses onto them.
So what's a bib tap?
Bib tap's basically just like a garden tap.
Right.
So you put a similar type of tap into the plant rooms. People then connect hoses on them. They can use that water. And if people spray that water around and there's Legionella in it, then that creates a risk.
You were about to say contaminated, weren't you?
Probably was, yeah.
Right, okay. But the point is, you're worried about how this might be used, as it were, out of design.
Just the design of it.
Yeah.
This is something that people will use if people are working in plant rooms like us, and if we needed water for any reason, you could go to this bib tap, and if there's, if we have water that's got Legionella in it, then that creates a risk to the tradespeople working on the site.
Very helpful, thank you. Could we go through to page 165? This is more to remind you, because I think you probably do this from memory. What was your concern about EPDM flexible hoses?
EPDM hoses, they've kind of got like a rubber inside them. They're generally metal braided hoses with a rubber.
And where are they used?
They're used to make connections onto taps from the hard piped.
So you'd see them under a sink often?
Either under a sink, yeah, you see them under a sink, or like under a bath, connecting that up. So they use them to connect up some of the fittings on the water system.
And your view is they should be replaced?
And it's not just my view, it's the NHS put out a guidance note. I can't remember the number of it, but there was a guidance note issued by the NHS to say they shouldn't be fitted unless under specific circumstances.
And what is it about this rubber lining that's an issue?
It tends to, you get microscopic cracking in it, and it allows bacteria to get into the microscopic crack, and you can't flush it out, you can't disinfect it out, and it just becomes an area where microorganisms can live and then seed into the water system.
Could you go to page 196, please? Now, I'm going to use this page. It may be the wrong place, but to ask you about low turnover. I'm just checking I'm on the right place. Low turnover pipework. And there's a lot of discussion in your report. It's in the middle of the I think I'm in the wrong page, but I think I can ask you the question without going to the page. In the report, you mention concepts of dead legs, and you discuss low turnover pipework, and it's quite a repetitive theme. What was your concern in 2015 about such low turnover pipework / dead legs in the hospital?
What happens when you've got low turnover like that is the water within that pipework will rise or fall to ambient temperatures, which will generally be mid-20s. And then that goes into the temperature range where microbiological growth can occur. And so therefore that runs the risk of us.
And what's the, other than simply removing those sections of pipework, which might not be possible, what's the other way of managing that risk?
Put them onto a flushing regime, whether a couple of times a week as a minimum, and make sure that the water is pulled through and the water is replaced in that.
And that's literally a member of estate staff goes to that tap, flushes it for a certain amount of time.
Yes.
Or would ward staff do that sometimes? Or?
It's within the hospital, they split it across facilities, sometimes clinical, sometimes us acting on behalf of estates that we carry out the flushing regime that's required in various different areas.
And would that be part of a plan?
Yes, it's documented that this is required.
Is that plan preventive maintenance?
Yes.
It is, right. Can I ask you to look at this is about the bypass, which we've already discussed.
Yes.
So you gave some evidence earlier on about a bypass pipe that you found when you first went to the site and had been removed after a bit, but you didn't know who'd removed it. Yeah. In your statement, question 57, which is on page 25 of that bundle, I just didn't understand the answer. I thought we've gone too far. There we are. Third question down. Describe the issues, if any, associated with the bypass pipework mechanism of the Hargate Road mains. And you said the bypass was a temporary installation which bypassed the filtration plant, which DOA understands was a control measure for the water system, introducing unfiltered water into the system. I simply want to know, why would you want to do that? What's the reason? Why is it a control mechanism to introduce unfiltered water into the system?
The filters were put in for a purpose to take particulate out from the raw water tanks before they fed the post-filter tanks, which means that we have less particulate coming into the tanks, which can then feed through into the water system, which reduces the potential for microorganisms having anything to use as a metabolite to grow.
Ah, right. I understand that. That's very helpful. Thank you. Right. Now, what I want to do is go back to a flushing regime issue. Could we go to... Did you just supply Mr. Parry with a sample document for a flushing regime as part of this exercise?
I believe we did.
Could we look at bundle 25? It's an email. I've not written down the page number, so... Sometimes the plans just don't work out. It's from the 16th of January 2015. Page 719, please. No, that's the written scheme one. So I think what we'll do is I'll pass over that. I might come back to it. I think there's a 16th of January. It's a different document. Yeah. So what I want to do is ask you about the Horn Optitherm taps. So these are the taps that had the mixing system inside the tap that you were talking about earlier.
At the clinical outlets, yes. There's different ones for different outlets.
Now, when you visited the site in 2015, were you aware of any requirement to carry out planned preventative maintenance on the taps?
Yes, TMVs or TMTs as they are should be serviced periodically.
Did you see documentation that set out when that should be done and how frequently?
I think document DOA, and within the SHTM it gives guidance as to when that should be.
No, I realise that, but did you actually see a plan?
No.
No. Right.
Sorry, I misunderstood.
Yeah. If we can go back to page 748 of the bundle, please. Yes, sorry, this was the thing I was desperately trying to find out. This has been emailed from you to Mr. Parry on the 16th of January, providing an example method statement for flushing. I'm assuming that would tend to suggest there wasn't one at the time. If you were providing a...
I'm going to guess that would be the case.
Yeah.
I can't remember.
Now, we also asked to provide an example management structure for the hospital.
We provided that within the previous email you pulled up. There was guidance to the written scheme, and within that we provided templates for
So you provided templates for a flushing regime, for a guidance system, for the written scheme. From your point of view as a person who assesses the L8 risk in hospitals, is it usual to be providing these documents to health service organisations?
It's not unusual.
It's not unusual.
It's not unheard of.
Not heard of. Okay.
Just from my notes, Ms. Magdorsh, 2 templates provided, one for a written statement, the other
a written scheme. And
written scheme, yes.
A flushing regime and a management structure, Mr. Watson. Those 3.
Thank you.
The management structure is page 718. And the written scheme, page 719. So what I want just to check with you at this point is, we've gone to various emails between you and Mr. Parry. To whom did you report the results of this risk assessment from 2015?
Ian Powry.
Ian Powry. And could we look at page 354 of bundle 6? So this appears to be a table that you've included in the report headed additional roles and responsibility during the phased occupation period.
Yes.
Why are there so many blank spaces in it?
Because nobody gave us the names to complete the table.
Okay. When you reported the report to Mr. Parry, how did you do that?
Well, how did we deliver?
Did you deliver it verbally, by email, post, or?
The entire report? Or
Yes, the entire
the
report.
entire report was delivered by, I believe it was Darren Waldron, who worked for us at the time. And we printed off a couple of copies of the report, and we also burned them onto a CD, how old it was. And they were delivered by hand to Ian.
And
Just so I'm following that, so you'd have a hand delivery of 2 paper copies plus the report burned onto a CD?
Yes.
Right, thank you.
and if we go to page 706 of bundle 25, this is why I'm trying the patience of my colleagues behind you, I think. This appears to be an email from Alan McRobbie
Yes.
to both you and David Watson on the 6th of May 2015, reporting that Darren will deliver a draft copy of the Leisure Road risk assessment and pseudomonas report to this afternoon. Do you see the section that heads the information recommended to reflect our recent conversations with you, Jim, and Mel?
Yes.
So were you involved in these conversations that Mr. Robbie is referring to?
As we were on site doing parts of the risk assessment, we would catch up regularly with particularly Ian to tell him what we had saw on site that day and if there were any issues. So there were ongoing conversations all the way through.
And was Jim Jim Guthrie?
Jim Guthrie and Mel McMillan.
Mel McMillan. Now, there's been some suggestion in paperwork we've seen, which might come from other witnesses, that Mr. Bratty was involved in this process. Is that something you recollect?
Not in the initial risk assessment, no.
No, in 2015.
2050. I don't remember dealing with David at that time, no.
Now, what response would you have expected to have been given to your risk assessment by the Water Safety Group and Mr. Parry upon its receipt?
Response to us?
Well, how should they have reacted to that report?
They should have read the report, and then ideally they should have created an action plan to look into and investigate and how they would go about correcting any of the recommendations we made. Is what I would have expected to happen.
And based on what you know now, did they do that?
I have no idea.
Have you ever seen an action plan dated 2015? No. Now, this is obviously, I think, a question you might not be able to answer, but if you're a contractor brought in to carry out Legionella and Pseudomonas risk assessments, and you become aware of a client not acting on your recommendations, and I'm not saying this he did in this case, but just in hypothetical terms, do you feel under any obligation to report that to anyone?
We would try and encourage the client to act on the recommendations of our risk assessment is what we would do, and we would escalate that. But at the time for this report, we carried out this report and then we had no involvement with the adult and kids hospital. After the report was handed over, we had practically no involvement. And so our understanding was they were managing that building, the water systems in-house.
So did you have any further we've got some correspondence to show you. Could you look at page 684 from bundle 25? So this bears to be a letter which I think your company supplied the inquiry with.
Yes.
I think it's not from you. If we go to, what?
I think it was from Alan.
From Alan, yes. And it's dated the 9th of June 2015. That's about a month after you produced the report. What's the purpose of this letter?
I think if you go to the back of the letter, we did a gap analysis on their management scheme.
Yep.
And so that was Alan.
You can see that in the middle of the page, can't we? Gap analysis as advised by estates managers in meeting of 28th of May.
Yes.
So this meeting of the 28th of May, do you remember this meeting?
I can't remember if I was at the meeting or not. It might tell you within the document whether I was.
We'll go and look a little bit further forward, but this appears to be a quote.
Yes. What Alan did, we're a business after all, so what Alan did at the end of carrying out the gap analysis and us doing the risk assessment was we provided costs for the NHS if they wanted to take up our offer of assisting them with managing the water system and carrying out a lot of the PPM tasks which we had identified were necessary. So it was us providing a quote to carry out.
And this is the plumbing side of your business, isn't it?
No, this is, we do the consultancy, which is the risk assessment, but we also take on, this would be Elliott monitoring, is probably the best way of describing it. So it's us carrying out the basic PPMs. The plumbing sits separate, and that's physically changing water systems.
I see. So this isn't, for example, changing the expansion vessels. This is just flushing them.
Yes.
Right. Could we scroll through this document onto the next page, and you see some of the consultancy fees and the sampling that you're offering to do?
Yes.
And then plumbing works. There's some discussion there at the bottom of the page that you're offering to discuss. And then we go to the next page, and we have Mr. McRobbie's signature. The next page in our bundle appears to be the next page of the document, which is a summary of management tasks. And this is effectively what you're offering to do.
No, this is the gap analysis that we carried out on the management system and their PPM regime.
So this was carried out on the 28th of May meeting?
Yes, if that's the date Alan referenced, yeah.
Yeah. And so we can see there everything that's not being done that should be done in your company's eyes.
It wouldn't be just us making that decision. We would have asked, can you show us this? And if they're not able to provide it, or if they physically told us they weren't doing it, we would record that. It's not just us making a decision.
So this sounds like quite a, I mean, I know you don't remember being there, but in general terms about gap analysis meetings, this sounds quite an involved dialogue of some sort.
Yeah, it's basically taking all of these questions we have and sitting with the estates managers and asking them to explain what they're doing and showing us the records that things are being carried out, so that we can see, is the management system in place and is the PPMs in place, and therefore is the water safety guide plan being actually implemented as it should be.
Okay, so
right, just so that I'm following, I think it's quite clear from what you've been saying, but you describe this as a gap analysis. It's a list of things which either you consider have not been done, or you want to know if they have been done. And it's phrased, I mean, there's a question mark at the top of the right-hand side. So it's phrased as a sort of list of questions directed to GGC estates.
Yes.
Thank you.
And indeed, if we go on to page 689, for example, something exciting has happened. This may mean we're going to have a, it's back, right, yes. No. What we'll do is I'll let my colleagues fight the software and I'll ask you a question. Oh no, here we are, I've got it here regularly, right. So the second row, daily check the flow and return temperatures and domestic hot water clarifiers using the temperature gauges fitted or suitable surface temperature probe required until such time as estate staff have full access to the BEMS system. What's the BEMS system?
A building engineering management system.
Some sort of computerized checking system.
Yes, it's where they'll have sensors or whatever around the building, feeding information back, giving them temperatures, clarifiers, etc.
It tends to suggest on 28th of May 2015 they didn't have access.
They didn't have access, certainly when we did the initial part of this, but there was a point where they advised us they did have access.
I see.
But I can't remember the
But that
exact
wasn't
date.
the reason I was going to the line, which is your entry in the right-hand column is this is being carried out, quote, regularly by NHS estates, although no record of this was being maintained. Why is that an issue? That sort of approach to management of water systems?
If we're just not creating a record that we're actually having those clarifiers or temperatures checked on a daily basis. So we would want to see that is documented and recorded. So otherwise, how do we know whether somebody done it yesterday or the day before, and how often it's being done? So we would expect to see something there to say, yes, this has been checked on the day.
Well, I'm not going to go through this whole document, but I would just check is that if this is attached to Mr. McRobbie's letter,
yes,
this is your business's records of that meeting.
yes,
Right. Thank you. Now, I want to just move on to see what happens after the 2015 risk assessment. So after the 8th of May, we have some understanding that you might have carried out some decontamination work in Ward 4C in 2016.
I believe it was 4A.
4A, all right, well, that may be why we're confused. Who asked you to do this?
I believe it came from Jim Guthrie.
Jim Guthrie, okay. And what was the method used?
We isolated the water supply to 4A, and we injected a disinfectant and pulled it through to all the outlets within the ward, left it for a contact time, and then flushed it all back out. We carried it out over a night shift.
And this would have been hydrogen peroxide?
Possibly, yeah.
Possibly, but...
It will be within our records what we used.
Right, but you did it exercise in 4A, not 4C. That's why I wanted to check. That's helpful. Now, the next question is that sort of work was required in a new hospital remarkable or not remarkable? Or is it something we should just... Not remarkable.
Especially remarkable. No.
Okay. Now, the next document I'd like to look at is Bundle 25, Document 35, page 678. Now, this document is not word searchable in our systems. We just have a flat JPEG of it, which may be why some people haven't noticed it until recently. So this letter appears to be dated the 8th of November 2016, addressed to Mr. Colin. Could that be Colin?
Colin, pardon.
Colin,
That's a mistake.
And who's the author of this letter?
It should tell you at the bottom.
At the bottom, we can scroll down. We'll see who it is.
It's from you. It's either myself or Alan, yeah. So it was myself.
Now, what are you being asked? What are you providing your quote to do here?
It's to basically review the 2015 risk assessment with a view to seeing what actions have been taken and are there any additional recommendations we would make in relation to the water system.
Would it be possible for someone, well, firstly, the letter's been copied to Mr. Parry, I see.
Yes.
Do you recollect whether you spoke to Mr. Purdon or Mr. Parry about this back in 2016?
We wouldn't have sent the quote, as it says, as per your request. We wouldn't have just sent it without being requested to send the quote. So we obviously spoke to somebody and they said they wanted to do an update of the risk assessment.
So this is quite an unfair question, but I think I have to ask it. Okay. Would it be possible for someone to receive your 2015 report, attend the gap analysis, receive all those emails about water schemes and flushing regimes, and then request or be copied into a quote for request to update the assessment and not know what was in the 2015 assessment, in your eyes? I need to press you because it's your report.
Sorry?
Do you think it's possible for someone to do all this and not know what's in the report?
If they didn't read the report, then it's possible they didn't. But had they read the report, then
they would have known.
They would have.
Right. Okay. Now, we have a document which is an updated written scheme from December 2016, which is Bundle 18, Volume 2, page 872. Now, this has your logo in the top right-hand corner.
Yes.
Sorry, that was Bundle 2 documentation.
Bundle 18, Volume 2, my lord, page 872.
Thank you.
And it's document Document 111. Now, I'm not going to go through this in detail. I just want to observe that I notice that there are now names against the standard jobs. And this appears to be dated the month after the quote letter we've just received.
Yes.
When was the work done by DMA Canyon to assist in producing this report? Can you recollect that?
I have no recollection of this document whatsoever. When it was sent to me and I read through it, I can't remember producing the document, but that wouldn't be unheard of, because we produce documents less on a regular basis, and it was unremarkable at the time, but I don't remember producing
So it could have been produced then, or it could have been produced before, you just don't know.
It could have been, I would assume that if we're calling it a 2016 update, it would have been produced in the weeks previous to that, so sometime.
But you don't know.
November, December of that year was when we would have done the work. It could have been done by Alan, and I wasn't involved.
I now want to move on to the 2017 risk assessment.
Okay.
Which is in bundle 6, and it's on page, it's document 30, 416. Now, looking again at the text below the picture, we see some dates. We see the dates of the site survey in September and October 17, and this gap analysis in January 18. Is that the same sort of meeting as we were discussing from 20?
It would have been the same process.
Same process, right? And then you set a recommended review date. Is that to redo the exercise or something else?
That's when we would say that you should review your risk assessment to say, has it been, have you actioned the recommendations within the report, and has anything else changed? So it's just us saying you should review this document.
Because that's quite an acceleration. It's to 1 year, in fact, in this case. You had a report in 15.
Mm-hmm.
You were asked to provide a quote in November 16. You do this work in 17.
Yeah.
And then you ask for a review within a year.
Yes.
Are we to draw any inference about
by the time
why you want to do that?
By the time that this risk assessment was produced, there was already the incident happened, which the incident which happened in 2A.
Yes.
And so we were already aware of that. So we would have been saying that we would be, for us, it would have been more of a priority to make sure that your risk assessments were kept up to date.
So I want to understand what you mean by the incident in 2A. So we're going to just check in on the dates here and get a clear understanding of your understanding. So are you saying that, I'll ask you what the incident was in a moment, but you're saying the incident that happened in 2A is before or about the time of September, October when you're doing the work?
No. It was around, it would have been around the time of the gap analysis when I started to become aware of it. And this document would have been produced and handed over at that point.
So sometime, well, we can see the date of submission in a moment, but we'll look at the date of submission. So that's the next page, or 2 pages on, page 417. So we have an actually submission date of April.
Yeah.
So this knowledge about the incident in 2A, could that have been closer to April than January, or do you have a recollection?
I think it was February, March we started to become aware of it.
Right. And how did you become aware of it?
Because we were asked to assist in doing some disinfections and some sampling work.
So you'd been in the hospital in 15?
Yes. You
had no involvement apart from the 4A disinfection we talked about, and then you'd come back, and in 2017 you start doing site survey work, and then you're in the hospital in the early months of 2018.
Yes.
And that's when you become aware of. So what is the incident in 2A to which you refer?
It's where they identified Cupria vidus in the water system, and then we were asked to do disinfections, and from that then we were asked to do sampling around the hospital. And that's what we would refer to as the incident in 2A.
So who was giving you, well, firstly, who instructed you to do this report itself?
This report would have been...
It says Tommy Romeo.
I was going to say it should be Tommy Romeo had done it. Yeah.
And who asked you to do the other work you've just described?
Well, that was coming from the Estates Department, a combination of Tommy and Ian Powry, I believe.
Right. Okay. Now, at this point, when you carry out this exercise,
Sorry, Michael, combination of Ian Powry and,
Tommy Romeo.
thank you.
Mr. Romeo is giving evidence next week, Lord. At this point, so that's September, October, what awareness did you have of whether the issues raised in the 2015 report have been actioned?
We hadn't had any, as I say, we didn't practically no involvement in the building between the carrying out the initial risk assessment and the second risk assessment, other than as you described.
So when you go on site for your visits in September and October and you start doing the assessment,
yes,
how do you then become aware? Well, are there things that are the same as they were 2 years before?
we're just physically seeing that dead legs that we'd identified were still in place and hadn't been removed. So it's physically seeing issues that we'd identified.
Well, let's go and look at the executive summary on page 421. Now, of course, we can read this, and I don't want to go through the stuff we've already read, because I see that some of the narrative appears in each report,
Yes.
not unreasonably. It's the bottom half of this page I want to look at. So there's a fifth paragraph in the bottom. Whilst DMA were completing the Legionella management gap analysis, so that would have been in January 2018, we were advised that the Hargate main road supply was shut down due to operational issues creating a dead leg on the supply. Is that a new dead leg or one you'd seen before?
That would be a new one, because that's referring to, it looks as if we've referred to the entire main supply being shut off for some reason.
And the next paragraph, you discuss a RHS, that's right-hand side.
Yes.
Trades water tank appears to be isolated for approximately 3 years. Is this the same tank that was isolated in the 2015 report? Yes. And on page 424, there's discussion of chlorifiers. Now, when we talked about the chlorifiers before, you would, if I understood it correctly, you were describing two sorts of incidents. There was an event on the 21st of April when there'd been a particular problem, and there were some wider issues that you'd noticed.
Yes.
Which of those two problems, if any of them, were still around when you came back 2 years later? Or was it a different problem you came back to find and I misunderstood?
I think the temperature profile of the chlorifiers was generally pretty good.
Right.
But we were still seeing that the expansion vessels still hadn't been replaced.
These are the hot water expansion
The
vessels.
hot water expansion vessels were still on the dead leg type system,
Right.
and they weren't changed to flow through. And some of the hot returns were below 55 degrees, which Brookfield had advised us was a control setting that they had advised.
But they're not as low as 40 or 45.
No, I think they said they were almost always above 50 degrees.
Yes. Now, you carried out, obviously, later on in this document, you have your risk assessment tables. And I want to just jump forward to page 429. The bottom of the page. So there seemed to me to be fewer high risks than there were.
Yes.
Without going through it line by line, because I think we have to be efficient use of time, what were the sort of changes that you were and indeed weren't seeing between 15 and 17 in this?
The chlorifiers in particular was saying that there were, I don't believe any of the chlorifiers were offline, creating the dead legs. I think the temperature in the stored water within the chlorifiers was much better. It was generally 60 degrees. There may have been a couple of exceptions. And so therefore it just, the control around the clarifiers just seemed to have tightened up.
So that had tightened up.
Yes.
Thinking through all the different topics we went through before, dead legs, had that changed?
Most of the dead legs that we'd identified in 2015 were still in place.
The flushing regime, was that now?
Sorry, I just didn't hear that. Most of the dead legs
They're still in place. They're
still in
there.
place.
Yeah.
Was the flushing regime now in place, or?
I think our gap analysis covers that. I don't believe there was a flushing regime for all those dead legs in place at that time.
Did you see a flushing regime being operated for the home optotherm taps?
Those are just the taps that are in patient rooms, so they would just, you wouldn't have them on a flushing regime unless the room was put out of use, because the natural usage of the patients and the staff.
Because I recollect you saying something about how there'd been guidance for home optotherm taps, they required to be flushed and maintained. I may have misunderstood this morning.
They were just the standard taps that are in the.
Well, if
in
that's
the-
not an issue that worried you, then
Maybe I've misled you.
no, that's fine. If it's not an issue that worried you at the time, that's fine. Can we go up that page to the big block of text? Now, this is this block where you have the historic information.
Mhm.
What I wanted to check in first here, and use this as an opportunity just to check, is were you seeing Legionella in the water in this system?
We were testing it for Legionella as part of our risk assessment. Any sampling was carried out in-house by the NHS.
And this is where you discussed the cuprovidus infection test that you were seeing?
Yes.
In terms of the management of the water system, so that's the PPM and the management system,
Yes.
how had your view changed between 15 and 17?
They obviously started to put some things in place, but I don't think it was documented and in the structured fashion that we would have expected to see at that point.
Okay. Now, I'm going to go to page 428, which is back one. I think that's where you just said what you just said, so I probably don't need to go into any detail. If I just clarify that I've got all the points, the clarifiers are closer to being in range.
Yes.
Some of the dead legs are still there.
Yes.
There isn't full information about flushing regimes. There is some of the written management documentation, but not everything.
Yes.
And although there are still high risks, there's now more medium risks.
Yes.
Can you give me that list again, Ms. Mangdosh?
So-
I'm afraid you were too quick for me.
So the clarifiers are generally back in range.
Yes.
The dead legs that were there in 2015 are still there.
Yes.
The flushing regime isn't being evidenced.
No.
There is a written scheme and management structure to some degree.
Yes.
And the PPM, I didn't ask, is the PPM system running? Is a PPM regime up and running to a satisfactory standard?
Again, there were some gaps in the
Some
PPM.
gaps.
If you look at the gap analysis,
Okay.
we identified some gaps in that.
Now, given that this point, you're in the middle, they're in the middle of this incident that you've talked about, I think it might be helpful to look at the gap analysis in detail, which is on 597. So this appears to be a note of a meeting on the 30th of January 2018. So this would have been before probably you knew about the cuprovidus issue.
Probably, yeah.
And you've got reporting that Mr. Bratty, Mr. McCallister, Mr. Romeo are present.
Yes.
Would Mr. Parry have been present, or is that him that he was not there, information was provided?
If we didn't record him as being there, then he wouldn't have been there.
I understand that. Now, going through these things, the main issue I want to ask you about is record keeping. So the second substantive line down, which begins where estates have advised, why is not keeping records an issue?
It doesn't demonstrate that you're managing the water system and keeping records of the system is in control, or identifying issues where it's out of control or remedial actions are required and then acting on those.
Is it possible that you could be managing it properly, you just haven't recorded it?
Yes, it's perfectly possible.
If we go further down the page, there's a suggestion that the third paragraph from the bottom, suggestions that the written scheme guidance 2015 has not been updated. And there's a general written scheme and the discussion of feedback. When should this all have been done? This written scheme, have it completed?
A written scheme should have been implemented as soon as the water systems were filled. From that point on, you should be managing the water system. So this would go all the way back to the first water being put in during the construction phase.
And is there any reason why it would be acceptable not to do it promptly?
I can't think of any.
Okay. Now, if we think back to 2015, if you can't answer this question, please don't answer it, it's outside your experience. To what extent do you think that the water system, domestic water system in the hospital in 2015 complied with relevant regulations, guidance and good practice?
I think, as we stated in our risk assessment, we highlighted there were some areas where it didn't comply, and we made recommendations in our risk assessment to areas where we thought some changes should be made to that water system.
And in 2017, to what extent did it comply with relevant regulations, guidance?
The same. Obviously, we made recommendations.
Okay. Now, you then carried out another risk assessment in 2019.
Late 2018 and 2019.
Yes, which is in bundle 25, document 11 it starts. It's on page 379.
So we've got loads of documents here.
Well, the main page is 378, actually. Now, have you had an opportunity to read this document recently?
I've flipped through it, yes.
So what I'm going to do...
Kind of trying to pick out the pertinent.
Yeah, in order to be efficient, I'm going to try and ask you some general questions.
Okay.
Now, if you feel we need to go to the pages, we'll go to them. Don't hesitate to tell me, but I don't want to go through the whole way because I think it takes too long.
Okay.
So this report is issued in January 19, and you said that the work started in 2018.
Yes.
And in the previous year, that is 2018, had your company been working in the hospital?
What we'd started to do was, as I say, we carried out some disinfections in Ward 2A. We got involved in taking microbiological samples on behalf of the GG&C and taking them to their labs for processing. There were point-of-use filters fitted to what the hospital designated as high-risk areas. And so we were fitting the point-of-use filters in the tap and managing that process of fitting them and replacing them as and when they were due. And just over the course of 2018, the works that we did on site slowly increased.
Were you involved in the fitting of the chlorine dioxide system? No. Were you involved in the fitting of a third filter?
No.
No. So thinking about this report, who commissioned this report? It's on the second page of 379.
Phyllis Urquhart.
So that's a different person.
She was the compliance manager for the hospital at the time.
Right. Now, what I want to do is, this report, to my eyes, and I may be wrong, seems a longer report with more information in it. Is that just a distortion of my mind as I've been reading?
There is a bit more depth to this document.
Why is there more depth?
Part of the reason is when we get into the dead legs, one of the conversations we had, I think it was with Ian Powdy, but I may be mistaken, was rather than us just identifying there's dead legs, for example, in plant room 31, he asked us if we could give a real specific detail of exactly where that dead leg was so that it could be managed properly.
So removing any doubt.
Yes. So there were things like that, and we were just asked, and there were some additional points we were asked to incorporate into the risk assessment.
So I wanted to check all of what things that have changed since 2017 report by this point. Yeah. So obviously there have been some major changes in Ward 2B, 2A after the decant in September 18.
They did an upgrade of the water system, yes.
So the chlorine dioxide system
was in the process of being installed.
Done. There was some whole survey of the drainage system had been done?
We understand that, yes. But
you weren't involved in that?
We weren't involved in that, no.
And there had been further disinfection work to wash hand basins and showers and drains. Have you been involved in those?
We carried out disinfections in wards 2A, 2B. That was the only system disinfections we did. We were asked to assist with dismantling and cleaning some drains.
Right.
And then disinfecting them, but that's now been taken back in-house by the NHS.
Now, when it comes to the Horn Optitherm taps, I wanted to understand when you first got involved in or became aware of the discussion about removal of flow straighteners.
That would have been as part of this period, maybe spring, summer 2018.
So if there'd been some form of 2014 meeting to discuss the taps, which have come up with a suggestion of how they might be managed, you wouldn't have found out about that until the 2018?
We weren't involved in any means.
No. In terms of the number of dead legs, how does that change between 17 and 19?
I think they started to work through taking out some of the dead legs, like the ones to the steam humidifiers, which were never commissioned. I believe they were taken out and removed. But there are some other dead legs which are now just put on a flushing regime.
So the number reduced, but they're also flushing some.
Yeah, and I think like the off the trade system, all the irrigation pipe work has now been completely disconnected, and the vast majority of the bib taps off the trade system have gone. There's only a couple left in the 12th floor.
But if we go back to 2019,
that would have been around that time.
Around that time,
yeah.
Was there anyone who cleaned and disinfected cold water storage tanks?
DMA did.
You did that, and when did you do that?
2018, the summer, I believe.
And was that after the photographs taken of stuff that's in the tanks that was there before in 15?
We took photographs in 2015, 2017, and then as we cleaned them in 2018, there was some debris in the tanks, and we took some photographs of that debris.
And from your point of view, was it the same stuff or different stuff?
I believe it would have been the same stuff, because I'm not aware of the tanks being cleaned between 2015 and us cleaning them in 2018, but I may be mistaken.
Okay. Now we've already discussed the chlorified temperature, we won't get into that in detail anymore, and we've already discussed the expansion vessels. Now, I wanted just to ask, in this report, if we go on 10 pages to page 387. Because I noticed in here this discussion about temperature gain in the cold water system.
Yes.
You had explained to us earlier that when you were on site in 15, some of that temperature gain might be to do with the unoccupation of the hospital.
Yes.
And some of it suggest it might be design. By the time you get to 2019, the hospital has been occupied for 4 years. Are you able to help us about why there was still temperature gain?
At that point, the reason we would expect to see temperature gain is maybe some areas not having us.
Can you say that a bit louder?
Sorry. At that point, we would expect that to be caused by low use of the water systems, not having a high throughput of water. Because generally speaking, what we see is when you run the taps in an area, the temperatures do come down. But if there's areas or certain rooms where we're not seeing the temperatures drop, generally indicates that the water's not being pulled through.
And so, although you don't design hospitals, if there are places in the hospital where the water is not being used, is that a consequence of who's in those places or whether they're being used at all?
It could be a combination of the ward, the type of patients there are, and if the person in a particular room is bedbound, they're not going to be using the water services as much.
They won't use the ensuite shower, for example.
Yes.
Right. Now, I wanted to ask you, because it's going to come up a lot, were you involved in dealing with HI scribes as an author at any point? No. Were you aware of them being done, as it were, around you?
Sorry.
Was your work subject to HI scribe risk assessment?
If we needed to do anything like removing the IPS panels to get to pipework, then yes, there was scribes put in place, which is just a process that we have to follow in order for us to do our job. But we don't write the scribes.
And was there any change in your experience or company's experience of the ability to access behind panels between 2015 and 2019 over that period?
At 2015, we had free access behind the panels because there were no patients in the building, so we could effectively open anywhere we wanted because they hadn't cleaned the building to hospital standard at that point.
And in 2017, could you open things?
2017, we were restricted at that point as to what we could open.
So why would you need to take panels off to do your work as a risk assessor?
As we talked about earlier, the supply pipework to the TMTs is behind the panels.
TMT, you'll have to help us again.
Thermostatic mixing tap.
Thank you.
Sorry. As we want to get the hot supply temperature to the actual tap, we can't. It's very difficult for us to record that without taking the panel off and getting access to the hot.
Because the tap just penetrates the wall,
yes,
as it were.
The pipework comes down and connects in at the back of the tap behind the panels.
So you have to physically remove the panel to detect the temperature?
On the Optitherm taps, yes.
Yeah. And if there's a reason why you shouldn't do that, because of the nature of the patient groups, you just can't do it?
Anywhere we do it, we have to, we're effectively getting permission. Scribe is effectively our permission to take the panels off so long as we follow the instruction of the scribe as to what we do and how we clean and put things back.
Got it.
So it's more or less a part of our method statement for how we do the job.
If we could go to page 390. So this seems a much smaller version of a previous risk assessment page that we've looked at in earlier reports. And you seem to have given an overall assessment this time. And I want to understand why you've assessed the water system control regime as high risk when you've described changes that you've wanted to happen taking place.
Not all of the changes we would have expected to see if you look at the gap analysis, etc.
Yes.
Not all of the changes that we would have liked to have seen had occurred.
So not enough changes have happened, so it stays high risk. Okay. Could we go on to the next page?
And just as a state, there was an ongoing microbiological issue, and therefore that would feed into our thinking of what would create a high risk.
Now, what I want to do now is to move on to work you've done since 2019.
Yeah.
In the year, if we take the pandemic as a sort of major change in everyone's lives in March 2020, between the completion of this assessment, in fact, we can take this off the screen, and the end of February, beginning of March 2020, what work were you doing in the hospital then in 2019?
It was a continuation of the work I described earlier, fitting and managing the point of use filters on the taps. We carried out microbiological sampling. We carry out tank cleaning. And over time, we assisted the Estates departments to create a register of where all the dead legs that we had identified were and getting them onto a flushing regime. So there's a host of things that we do.
So again, it's about enabling the Estates department to do more.
Yes.
Yeah. And you've mentioned carrying out biological sampling or water sampling.
Yes.
Both in 18 and 19.
Yes.
What's the mechanism for you doing that? Let's break it down a bit. So were you provided with a method statement for each sample to take?
Because of the nature of our work, we generated method statements and submitted them on to the States Department, and that would have been passed to infection control and the microbiologists to see that our method statements met with their requirements.
And so let's just, we'll pick an imaginary exercise. You've been told, please take some samples from this particular room in this particular ward in 2018.
Yes.
And you come up with your own suggested method statement.
Which is based on industry guidance.
Indeed.
It's not just picked out of our heads.
Exactly. But let's imagine that you want, so you might decide to do a first flush, or you might wait, you do all the different versions. Would you do multiple ones?
Sometimes, yes.
Yeah. Would the method statement be different if you were trying to recover biofilm itself from if you're trying to recover just the water?
Biofilm is very difficult to recover in a water sample because by its very nature it's adherent to the internal surfaces of the pipework, and so therefore when we sample, it's what's available in the water that would be picked up in the analysis. It's not the biofilm.
So I was reading somewhere about the biofilm can go planktonic. Have I got that right?
It can, but
is that just a bit too dramatic?
It can do that, but it's very difficult then for us to say, well, that's biofilm we've picked up, or it's just bacteria. We're only putting it in, and the lab report back to us, this is the bacteria and the levels that we found in the water, if they found any.
So just to take a hypothetical example, imagine you've got a tap.
Yes.
Which is people are anxious about.
Mm-hmm.
So they want you to test it. Can you sample water from a tap without dismantling the whole system to recover any biofilm there might be on the pipework behind the panel? No. All you can do is recover the water.
We can recover the water, and if parts of the biofilm slough off and come into that, then it may be picked up by the lab. But there's nothing that we can do to say this will guarantee that we're sampling the biofilm. If we wanted to do that, we would need to open it up and either swab it or take sections of the pipework out and ship that away.
So there's a very much a different level of intrusion.
Yes.
Let's go back to microorganisms you know and understand, like Legionella.
Yeah.
If you wanted to recover Legionella for conventional testing that you normally do, what's the method you adopt for sampling a domestic water system?
Most times for Legionella, it's first flush samples that are taken in the initial instance, which is basically you turn the cold tap with the Thorn Optitherm. You would put the cold lever on and take the first flush of water.
And that's what's in the tap?
That's what's in the tap in the first section of pipework behind the tap. So we would take a litre of water, we would then let it run for a few seconds so that we can record the temperature. If we have chlorine dioxide, which we do now, we would then measure the chlorine dioxide at that point after we've collected the sample.
Actually, it next to the sink, as it were?
In the sink, yes. We've got a machine that we can take that, and it takes about a minute, and we can test the chlorine dioxide level at that. We would then shut that tap off, and then we would repeat the process for, we would refer to it as the mixed or the hot sample.
Which is coming out at 41 degrees.
Which is coming out. So it's a blend between the hot and the cold water.
Because you can't actually sample the pure hot.
No, the only place we can realistically do that is in DSRs.
Okay, that's an acronym again, you're going to have to help us.
Domestic Services Room Cleaners.
Cleaners room.
The cleaners room have got direct hot and colds. Staff kitchens have got a direct hot and cold, and I think it's the clean utilities generally have a direct hot.
But if you're just sampling in a particular patient room,
you can't get
the hot. Now, we heard in our reports of the concept of whole genome sequencing.
Yes.
Have you heard of this?
You're moving into microbiology.
There's a reason I'm asking you, and it's to do with Legionella.
Yeah.
Have you ever come across a situation where someone has wanted samples of Legionella to carry out whole genome sequencing? I didn't give any notice of this, but it just occurred to me over the weekend. No, well, I can't ask you questions, that's fine. So if we go back to the sampling regime, if you want to recap, you can catch the cold water through a first flush sample.
Yes.
You can catch the mixed water through another go.
Yes.
And you may or may not get bits of biofilm, but yeah, that's fine. Okay. That was very helpful. So looking at the
Can I
2019,
just
Yeah, sure.
clarify this? I mean, I think it's absolutely clear, but just hasn't been spelled out. You've talked about DNA Canyon carrying out the sampling.
Yeah.
Now, as I understand it, you would take a quantity of water, as Mr. McIntosh has taken you through, maybe as much as a litre, did you say?
For Legionella samples, it's a litre,
Yeah.
yes.
And what I'm assuming is you then package it in some way and send it off to a lab. Am I right?
Yes, most of our samples go to the water lab at the Glasgow Royal Infirmary, which is
Right.
run by the NHS. Sometimes, depending on the number of samples and the capacity at the Glasgow Royal, we send other samples off to Intertech on occasion, maybe another independent lab.
And a report is provided to you or directly to NHS GC?
The GRI lab reports to us, and also I believe there's an internal mechanism for the microbiologists within GGC. They get access to the system and they're notified about specs directly as well.
Right. And if it's to another lab, it comes
It comes into us and we then collate the samples and we report them back to the Estates Department.
When you say collate the samples, presumably by that it's on a spreadsheet or
Yes.
yeah. Okay. Thank you.
so on that topic, it might be, well, I won't take you to the pages, but the case notes, the case note review panel and our epidemiologist, Mr. Mukherjee, both were concerned about the labelling of samples from the hospital. And there's a sort of observation that sometimes the sample locations were less than precise or they varied in confusing ways. What was the system for labelling the locations you were taking the samples from when you started doing?
Is this a criticism of our sampling? Or?
I don't know. I don't think so. It's just in general.
Our sampling, the way we do it is when we submit it to the lab, we basically put a number on the bottle.
Yes.
And that's submitted to the lab.
So the lab don't know where it came from?
No, sorry. There's another step to that.
Right.
Then our guys on site will fill out a sheet that goes along with all the bottles, which will detail the floor we took it, the ward we took it, or the department we took it, the room that we were in, including the door code of the room.
Right.
And then we will identify the actual outlet that we took it from, whether it was the octotherm, whether it was the contour tap, whether it was a shower. We'll identify that. We will then record the temperature of the outlet, and after the chlorine dioxide was installed, we will also record the chlorine dioxide level as we took that sample.
So at least from your end of the process, the piece of paper that your team complete has room, individual water point fully identified.
I don't think there could be any doubt
No,
where
I
our
just
samples are taken
felt
from.
it was important to ask.
Yes, that's fine.
When it comes to the results coming back to you, you just said to His Lordship that you supply them to the Estates Department.
Yes.
Would you ever had cause to supply them to microbiologists or infection control doctors directly?
What we have is Suzanne in our office manages this process for us, and she's given for each of the samples that we take, depending on where they're taken from, we are given a distribution list of who all the samples should be emailed to. And so Suzanne compiles all the results into a spreadsheet, which just gets bigger and bigger as the year goes on. And Suzanne's got that distribution list, and some of the people on the distribution list will be microbiologists, yes.
But that distribution list comes from the hospital?
Yes.
Would you ever add to that list of your own volition?
No.
No. Now, I think probably this is a good place to start, because I'm about to turn to... actually, there's one more thing I can do before lunch break. In your statement, at question 42, at subparagraph A, which is on page 18, you have a discussion about sampling work done by others. Do you see how you're discussing? The main concern at the time of the 2019 report with regard to sampling results was in relation to cuprovidus and other organisms for which there was no guidance documents from the water hygiene industry to follow. And that's because, as you explained at the beginning,
Yes.
at Legionella you have a guidance, and this you don't, for which there are no guidance documents. This was covered within section 10 of our 2019 report. DMA Canyon did not receive copies of all the sampling results carried out during 2018, as much was held internally by GGC Microbiology and States, and actual analysis carried out by Glasgow Royal Infirmary.
Yes.
You did have access to some of the sampling results, the majority of potable and Legionella samples being within specification, but without specifications being for other organisms which there's no guidance documentation. And you said all out of specification results were, however, considered by DMA included within the report. What I wanted to ask is, if you didn't get all the results, how can you safely reach your conclusions? Because you seem to be describing that you only got some of these results.
When we were taking the samples in 2018, the microbiologists at the time held the results internally within GGC and they didn't share absolutely everything with us. Ian Powery periodically would share some sections of the results with us. And so that was us when we made our assumptions and our recommendations in the risk assessment. It was based purely on the results that we had available.
So you're just saying that, in effectively, you didn't have all of them.
Yes.
You had quite a lot, but
Yes.
all of them. Right. Okay.
There are significant, even now there's still significant gaps in our sample results for 2018.
Now, given that your background experience is limited to a short list of microorganisms, how can you express concern in this report about out of specification, or I suppose to put a word in your mouth, concerning results, when you're not a microbiologist who can assess whether it's worrying that this particular microorganism is in this pipework?
Because the states and the microbiology department issued parameters to us what they consider to be in and out specification.
So when you say in this report they're out of specification, those aren't your specifications?
No.
They've come through the GGC system?
They gave us the parameters when we were taking samples, because as we collate all the samples, we actually give them a summary and we pull out anything that's considered to be out of specification.
Right.
And so we issue that back to them so that you can see all the samples we've taken and what's out of specification. But in order for us to write the macros to pull those results out, they had to give us the parameters that we worked to.
So the only area where you're contributing to the process is the method?
Yes.
Everything else is set by the customer, who's GGC, right? And then you're reacting to their specifications.
Yes.
If it's out of specifications, because they chose it to be out of specification.
Yes.
I think that's a helpful place to break, my lord.
Yes.
The next document will be the 2023 report.
We'll do that, but just could I make sure I've followed that last line of questioning? If we're concerned with microorganisms other than Pseudomonas and Legionella, in order for you to be able to say they're out of specification, you require the parameters provided by to you by estates. Is that right? It comes from estate.
There's no guidance in our industry for a lot of these other organisms which were being tested for. We had no guidance, so we weren't able to inform the decision as to what was in or out of specification. It was given to us.
Now, as you've described, you having taken a sample of water, sent it for analysis, you get back the results. Do you did DMA Canyon sort of carry out taking the finger down the list of total viable counts with a view to saying what was out of spec, or does the laboratory give you the information?
They don't provide notification to us to say this is out of specification. Sometimes they will give us a summary sheet to say these are your out of specification results, and they'll sometimes come in before the full results. But the way that we record our results is we've put it into spreadsheets, and I've written a load of macros which sit in the back of those spreadsheets, and so we can hit a button and it just automatically pulls out based on the parameters provided to us, it creates a new tab on the spreadsheet, which then highlights everything, which is then classed as a specification.
I think I follow that. And the other point of detail is, if I've understood the evidence, your employee who's actually taking the water sample has got some mechanism for checking chlorine dioxide.
Yeah, we use a chemio unit. I can't remember what it was called before, but it's a little electronic box about this size that we take a sample of the water and we put a sensor in it, and it measures the chlorine dioxide for us.
Okay, and it gives not only the presence of chlorine dioxide, but some sort of measure.
Gives us a reading, yes.
Right. Thank you very much, Mr. Watson. Well, as Mr. McIntosh has flagged up, we'll take our lunch break. Could I ask you to be back for 2 o'clock?
Sure.